Long before pyramids rose against the desert sky, a different story was unfolding along the low, fertile ribbon of the Nile, a story shaped by water, stone, and the patient work of generations. Life in these riverine valleys was measured in cycles of flood and harvest, in the slow accretion of habitations and cemeteries, and in the steady refinement of tools and ideas. This narrative begins in the deep past, when mobile bands of hunters and gatherers began to settle, cultivating crops and domesticating animals, and slowly building the foundations of a civilization that would call itself timeless. The earliest chapters belong to what archaeologists call the pre-dynastic period, a long era of experimentation and regional diversity that stretched for millennia. Here, in scattered villages and seasonal camps, people learned to raise grain, herd cattle, and weave reeds into baskets and boats. Those pragmatic skills were the scaffolding for more complex social patterns. Surpluses allowed specialists to emerge, and specialists brought new crafts and rituals into being. One of the clearest signposts of this age comes from pottery, humble vessels that nevertheless carry the fingerprints of change. Pottery styles shifted from handmade coarse wares to finely burnished and painted forms, and those shifts map onto shifting identities and networks of exchange. The shapes and motifs on these bowls and jars are like chapters in a visual language, hinting at alliances and rivalries between communities up and down the Nile. Alongside pottery, stone tools and increasingly sophisticated flint techniques mark the refinement of craft. Flint was knapped with intent, blades were retouched to fit handles and hafts, and the careful making of knives and scrapers speaks to a growing specialization. Later, the first copper items appear, cold-hammered from native metal and traded over long distances, signaling a nascent engagement with metallurgy that would expand over centuries. Burials from the pre-dynastic reveal changes in belief and hierarchy as plainly as do houses or tools. Early graves were simple pits, sometimes accompanied by a few personal items, but over time tombs became more elaborate and began to cluster into distinct cemetery areas. Some burials included rich arrays of goods, beads, ceramics, cosmetic palettes, and the presence of extravagantly furnished tombs beside simpler ones argues for social differentiation, a widening gap between the ordinary and the elite. The Nile itself was an engine of connection and constraint, its annual inundation producing the green corridor that linked people together while isolating them from the harsher deserts. Navigating this river allowed the exchange of goods, ideas, and people, knitting upper and lower regions into networks that would eventually underpin state formation. Boats, often made from bundled reeds then later from planked wood, were the arteries of that network, carrying grain, pottery, and prestige items along the floodplain. Climate and environment played a decisive role in shaping early Egyptian lifeways. Periodic shifts in rainfall and river regime could press communities to adapt, sometimes moving, sometimes intensifying cultivation, sometimes concentrating power. The reliability of the Nile's flood made large-scale agriculture possible in a way that encouraged sedentism and the accumulation of surplus, and those surpluses fed both population growth and social complexity. As settlements grew, their architecture changed from ephemeral huts to more permanent rectangular houses built of mud brick, with storage pits and designated areas for craft production. Villages developed yards and workshops, and certain sites became specialized centers of pottery, stoneworking, or beadmaking. The emergence of such workshops suggests not only craft specialization but also the beginnings of craft control and perhaps early forms of redistribution. From the midst of these early communities rose cultural horizons with distinct styles and shared symbolism. The Bedarian culture, for instance, is known for its fine black-topped pottery and the inclusion of personal ornaments in graves, reflecting a taste for refinement and personal display. Later, Nakata cultures expanded on these tendencies, their painted pottery and elaborate grave goods signaling complex social identities and long-distance connections. Cemeteries at Nakata and other sites provide a roadmap of increasing social stratification and ritual complexity. Some tombs were modest and utilitarian, while others were surrounded by impressive grave goods and sometimes even the remains of attendants. Such displays point to leaders who were able to marshal resources and labor, people who could command loyalty and create visible signs of distinction. The rise of large pre-dynastic centers like Hierakonpolis, Abydos, and Nagata points to the concentration of power in certain locales. These towns were not yet states in the full sense, but they served as regional hubs where religious activity, craft production, and political prestige intersected. In places like Hierakonpolis, monumental architecture began to appear, platforms, enclosures, and public spaces that announced emerging collective identities. Religious practice and iconography evolved in tandem with these social changes. Early figurines, amulets, and painted motifs suggest developing notions of protection, fertility, and the sacred. Animals took on symbolic roles. Bulls, falcons, and crocodiles were invested with religious significance, and soon leaders would link themselves to these potent images to bolster authority. Central to understanding the transition to kingship is the development of symbols that encoded power. Maceheads and scepters, often found in elite contexts, became more than weapons or tools. They were emblems of authority, carved with scenes of dominance and reverence. Cosmetic palettes, elaborately incised with scenes of combat and procession, began to represent more than makeup. They became visual manifestos of triumph and status. One artifact stands out in this visual dossier: large ceremonial palettes, some bearing early narrative art that suggests both political ambition and ritual purpose. These palettes were polished stone canvases where rulers or their circles could announce victories, alliances, and cosmological claims. Their imagery and portable form made them effective instruments of propaganda in a world where words were yet to be widely written. Along with symbolic objects, administrative innovations were taking shape. Seals and tags show early attempts to record ownership and control the movement of goods, hinting at nascent bureaucratic practices. These small marks and tokens foreshadow the complex record-keeping that would become a hallmark of pharaonic administration, where scribes and registrars ensured the smooth flow of tribute and supplies. Trade networks widened during the pre-dynastic, linking the Nile to the Levant, the Aegean, and deep into Africa. Exotic materials, copper, gold, cedar wood, semi-precious stones, moved long distances and into the hands of emerging elites. Such prestige goods were not mere luxuries, they were the currency of diplomacy and legitimacy, used to cement alliances and to display power at home. As ranks of elites grew, so did rituals surrounding death and memory. Early mortuary practices show a concern with preserving identity through grave goods and with creating a durable social legacy. Tombs became stages on which lineage, wealth, and spiritual beliefs were theatrically performed, and the very act of burying goods became a way to narrate a person's place in the cosmos. The symbolic use of animals in ritual practice also deepened, forming the kernel of later sacred cults. Some communities selected certain animals as embodiments of divine power and care, breeding them and honoring them in special compounds. The reverence for animals developed not only as a reflection of ecological reality but as an ideological tool, establishing connections between humans, rulers, and the force of nature. With the growth of political complexity came competition and conflict. Fortified settlements and defensive architecture appear in certain regions, pointing to an environment where control over resources and trade routes mattered. Warfare was not constant, but martial prowess became a means to secure territory and prestige, and victory enhanced the political capital of leaders who could translate it into legitimacy. At the same time, ritualized displays of power provided an alternative to brute force. Processions, festivals, and carefully orchestrated ceremonies allowed leaders to project authority without continuous warfare. Public rituals reinforced bonds between a leader and his followers, and they integrated disparate groups into a shared symbolic world centered on emergent authority figures. Writing and proto-writing systems developed gradually out of practical needs. Before full hieroglyphic writing emerged, people used marks and signs to keep track of goods, destinations, and ownership. These early notations, incised on pottery or impressed on tokens, were the ancestors of phonetic signs and ideograms that would later script royal names and decrees. The process of state formation accelerated as the first dynasty loomed on the horizon of history. By the late pre-dynastic, certain rulers exercised influence over broad territories, collecting tribute, marshaling labor, and commanding religious loyalty. These leaders were no longer merely powerful heads of king groups. They were beginning to embody a new kind of centralized authority, one that combined secular and sacred functions. One of the most famous images from this transition is the Narmer palette, a stone plaque that, in its bold imagery, seems to claim the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. On it, a ruler is shown wearing the crowns of both regions, smiting enemies and aligning himself with divine symbols. Whether Narmer was a single unifier or a representative of a longer process, the palette crystallizes the idea of a king who stands at the apex of a unified realm. As kingship emerged, rulers began to be visually associated with deities, especially the falcon god Horus, who became the king's personal divine patron. This identification was more than symbolic. It granted the ruler a sacred mandate, painting him as a cosmic actor responsible for order and prosperity. The notion that a king was both human and invested with a divine aspect made centralized rule compelling to diverse populations. Titles and royal epithets emerged to express this dual nature. The king was Horus, he of the two lands, and Lord of the Mot, each title encompassing different responsibilities and cosmic roles. Such names fused geography, religion, and ideology, transforming a temporal leader into an eternal guarantor of balance and justice. Mot itself is a crucial concept for understanding the birth of pharaohs. Often translated as order or truth, Mot represented the principle that maintained the cosmos, the Nile's beneficent rhythm, and society's harmony. Kingship was portrayed as the institution tasked with upholding Mot, and rituals, laws, and monumental architecture all served to reaffirm that cosmic balance. One practical consequence of state centralization was the formalization of administrative offices. The title of vizier, or chief minister, would become a central node in the royal bureaucracy, responsible for tax collection, labor organization, and legal matters. Even in the earliest phases, scribes and overseers appear in the archaeological record, indicating a growing complexity of record-keeping and governance. Another key development was the creation of nomes, or territorial provinces, each with its own local administrator and cult center. The nome system allowed rulers to delegate authority while maintaining overall control through appointed officials and loyal elites. This structure created a tension between central power and regional identities that would influence Egyptian politics for centuries. Religious architecture also began to take shape in distinct ways, moving beyond temporary gatherings to permanent structures. Early temples were modest but symbolically charged spaces where offerings were made and rituals performed. Over time, these evolved into more monumental forms, setting the stage for the grand temple complexes that would characterize later periods. Funerary architecture in the late pre-dynastic foreshadowed the monumental tombs of the dynastic age. Simple pit graves gradually gave way to chambered tombs and stone-built structures, and certain cemeteries began to concentrate royal burials with rich assemblages. The practice of constructing durable tombs signaled a growing preoccupation with immortality and the means by which the living could ensure the welfare of the dead. At Abydos and other sacred necropolises, the earliest royal tombs were accompanied by subsidiary burials and offerings, suggesting that the dead king's needs would be provided for by a retinue even in death. Some of these practices hint at rituals in which retainers were buried or ritually interred alongside rulers, a practice that would later be replaced by symbolic substitutes such as figurines and servile objects. These early practices show how death and power were intimately intertwined. The evolution of material culture supports a narrative of increasing complexity. Gold and silver artifacts sparkle in graves, finely carved ivory and bone demonstrate exquisite craftsmanship, and beads and amulets reveal a sophisticated taste for personal adornment. Precious metals and imported materials became markers of status, used to distinguish elites visibly from ordinary people and to signify rulership. As craft specialization intensified, full-time artisans worked in organized workshops, producing standardized goods for the elite and the temple cults. The production of stone vessels, copper tools, and intricate jewelry required skill, time, and coordination, implying managerial oversight and perhaps centralized control of resources. These workshops would later be integrated into palace and temple economies as production centers tied to state power. Trade's imprint is visible in the presence of foreign objects and materials that do not occur naturally in the Nile Valley. Cedar planks from Levantine forests, lapis lazuli from distant Afghanistan, and obsidian from Red Sea islands all attest to long-distance connections. These trade links not only brought prestige items but also ideas and technologies that nourished local innovation. The formation of early markets and redistribution systems marks another stage in political maturation. Surplus grain and craft goods needed to be collected, stored, and redistributed for temple ritual, state projects, and elite consumption. Granaries and storage facilities, often attached to administrative centers, became essential nodes in the budding state's logistical network. Religious festivals and public ceremonies were vital instruments for forging collective identity, synchronizing labor mobilization, and celebrating seasonal cycles. These gatherings allowed rulers to display generosity and control, distributing food, goods, and symbolic rewards to participants. Through ritual spectacle, a king could transform the labor of many into a visible affirmation of his legitimacy. The symbolic geography of Upper and Lower Egypt played a crucial role in political discourse. The north, a delta marshland of creeks and channels, contrasted with the narrow, sunlit valley of the south. Rulers who controlled both regions could claim mastery over the river's full life cycle, and the iconography of the dual crown became a potent expression of that control. As the early dynastic state coalesced, urban centers expanded into more complex settlements with palatial compounds and carefully planned spaces for craft and administration. These concentrations of wealth and authority attracted migrants, skilled workers, and specialists, further reinforcing the center's power. The pull of such centers helped institutionalize labor management and bureaucratic mechanisms. The development of a royal ideology was crucial in binding these diverse elements together. The king was not merely a military leader or administrator, he was the linchpin of a religious and cosmic order. Through ritual, architecture, and visual propaganda, rulers propagated a narrative that positioned them as indispensable mediators between gods and people. Iconography played a vital role in this narrative. The falcon of Horus, the seraph that framed royal names, the enthroned figure, and the portrayal of the king smiting enemies were all part of a visual lexicon that conveyed authority at a glance. These images circulated on pottery, palettes, ceilings, and public monuments, embedding a shared language of rulership into everyday life. Burials continued to evolve into increasingly elaborate expressions of royal ideology. Royal tombs became the center of cultic activities that ensured the king's perpetual role in sustaining Ma'at. Provisioning for the afterlife led to a complex set of rituals and temple economies tied to the tomb and the cultic sustenance of the dead king. The burial landscapes of Abydos and the early necropolises reveal spaces that served both as royal cemeteries and as pilgrimage sites, where later generations would venerate ancestral kings. These sites anchored historical memory and created continuity between the living polity and its founders. The reverence for early rulers contributed to the sacralization of kingship, turning ancestral memory into religious authority. Administrative artifacts such as labels, tags, and cylindrical seals show an emerging concern for controlling names, titles, and flows of goods. Recording transactions and consignments became a central practice for the management of wealth and labor, and literacy began to be concentrated in a class of scribes trained to keep the state's records. Writing, in this sense, was not only a technology but a social practice that empowered administrators. Contemporary evidence for legal practices suggests that the king's courtroom or palace served as the ultimate source of justice. The emerging legal order relied on precedent, customary law, and the king's role as the guarantor of fairness. In disputes over land, labor, and succession, the palace and its apparatus acted as arbiter and enforcer. The interplay between ideology and material power is visible in the early construction of monumental architecture. Massive earthworks, mud brick enclosures, and stone-lined platforms were labor-intensive projects that demonstrated a leader's ability to command resources and manpower. Such projects were both practical, creating storage, ritual, and defensive spaces, and symbolic, making the leader's presence permanent in the landscape. Food production and its seasonal rhythms remained the backbone of society. Innovations in agriculture, irrigation canals, water control systems, and improved plowing boosted yields and stabilized food supply. Stable agriculture allowed the state to maintain standing labor forces for construction, craft production, and military needs, and it made possible the long-term planning of monumental works. The role of women in early Egyptian society, while often obscured in the surviving record, was nonetheless significant in domestic production, ritual life, and lineage. Some titles and inscriptions later attest to women holding economic authority and religious offices, and royal women were central in succession and dynastic continuity. Their influence was mediated through marriage alliances, cultic roles, and the management of estates. Religion and rite became tools of governance as temples grew into economic as well as spiritual centers. Land and labor were dedicated to temples, which in turn managed production, stored wealth, and orchestrated ritual calendars. The temple economy provided a parallel axis of power, and the relationship between temple and palace would remain a defining tension throughout ancient Egyptian history. As nascent kingship matured, funerary practices became increasingly institutionalized. The idea that the dead king required an eternal maintenance crew led to the establishment of cults and priesthoods devoted to his service. These priesthoods managed offerings, tended to memorials, and sustained the king's presence through recurring ritual, forming an enduring link between past and present. The iconography of kingship also absorbed regional traditions, adopting local deities and symbols to create a syncretic royal persona that appealed to diverse populations. By aligning the king with local gods and cults, rulers incorporated the allegiance of disparate communities into a broader political framework. This syncretism allowed the state to be both unified and flexible in its religious diplomacy. Military organization took on new forms as leadership attempted to protect trade routes and assert control over rebellious territories. While the Egyptian landscape did not favor large standing armies in the earliest period, leaders could mobilize seasonal labor and levies for campaigns and construction projects. Military success and the promise of spoils were persuasive incentives for loyalty and a source of wealth for rulers to redistribute. The evolution of art and iconography during the pre-dynastic and early dynastic was marked by increasing naturalism and symbolic clarity. Human figures became more stylized in their royal depictions, and animals were rendered with a symbolic economy that emphasized power and divine favor. Public imagery became an instrument of statecraft, teaching communities to read the social order in recognizable signs. Technological innovations continued apace. Pottery kilns became more efficient, copperworking techniques improved with annealing and casting, and the use of stone tools in monumental contexts was refined. These technological strides allowed builders and artisans to attempt more ambitious projects, linking craft mastery to political ambitions. Seasonal festivals and the cult calendar structured social life, aligning agricultural work with religious obligations. Celebrations of harvest, New Year, and royal anniversaries provided rhythm and continuity to society, and the temple calendar coordinated communal labor and consumption. The king's presence at certain festivals reinforced his role as the mediator of cosmic time and social order. Provincial religion and local elites retained significant autonomy even as central authority expanded. Known governors maintained control of local shrines and resources, and the balance between central appointments and hereditary local officeholders shaped political negotiation. At times, regional leaders pushed back, negotiating power through alliances, marriages, and strategic defiance, keeping the central authority attentive and adaptive. Cultural expression in dress, jewelry, and personal ornamentation reflected social status and identity. The wealthy adorned themselves with gold, faience beads, and finely woven linen, while hairstyles and cosmetics indicated group affiliation and rank. Visual display was not frivolous, it was a language of power, signaling access to resources and participation in elite networks. The consolidation of craft and administrative centers supported urban growth, drawing people into nucleated settlements where coordination and supervision were more effective. Urban centers concentrated wealth and labor and became crucibles of innovation in arts, religion, and politics. The pull of such centers accelerated centralization, creating environments where the idea of a single ruler over a unified land was conceivable and practicable. The progression from regional chiefs to pharaohs was neither inevitable nor straightforward. It was the result of many converging forces: environmental stability, agricultural surplus, craft specialization, trade, ritual innovation, and the persuasive power of royal ideology. Each advance fed the next. Surplus allowed monuments, monuments reinforced ideology, ideology justified labor, and labor produced the material conditions for further centralization. The birth of the pharaoh as a sacral monarch is thus best seen as a cultural and institutional achievement rather than a single moment. It involved the gradual layering of religious symbolism onto political power, the consolidation of administrative practices, and the invention of ceremonial forms that made kingship intelligible to a diverse populace. By the time the first dynasty took shape, kingship had acquired the trappings that would endure for 3 millennia. The earliest pharaohs not only governed but performed cosmic functions, participating in rituals that ensured the Nile's flood and the fertility of the land. Their role was codified in ceremonies that combined practical coordination, such as the distribution of grain, with exalted ritual that connected them to gods and ancestors. They thus became both managers of earthly resources and custodians of cosmic order. Material culture under early pharaohs shows remarkable elaboration. Stone stele inscribed with royal names, finely carved ivory labels bearing administrative notes, and monumental tomb complexes that physically claimed the landscape. The physical imprint of a pharaoh's reign was meant to endure. Stone and inscription were chosen precisely for their permanence, a deliberate opposition to the ephemeral human lifespan. Underpinning all this was a narrative of continuity that legitimized the present by rooting it in an ancestral past. Royal ancestor cults functioned to tie current rulers to the virtuous founders, providing moral and spiritual sanction for contemporary rule. Such narratives were both practical and poetic, knitting memory into the fabric of governance. Even as kingship stabilized, tensions and negotiations continued between central authority and local privilege. Known leaders, temple interests, and powerful families all had stakes in the distribution of wealth and ritual. Managing these competing claims required diplomatic skill, marriage alliances, and sometimes force, and the institutional flexibility to accommodate local customs while asserting central priorities. Art and writing matured into sophisticated systems that recorded not only events but complex ideas about kingship, divinity, and society. Hieroglyphs became a medium for eternalizing royal achievements and for crafting a public memory that would outlast the reign of any single monarch. Through inscription, rulers wrote themselves into eternity, ensuring that their names and deeds resonated across generations. The development of state religion created a durable framework of beliefs that bound people to the polity. Temples organized labor, regulated economic activity, and served as loci for communal worship. The integration of temple and palace economies created interdependencies that reinforced central authority, and priests became essential managers of wealth and ritual continuity. As dynastic authority strengthened, so did the social institutions surrounding it. Courts, tax systems, record-keeping, and military arrangements coalesced into recognizable forms. These institutions allowed the state to plan large-scale projects, from monumental tombs to irrigation works, and to mobilize labor on a scale that predated many other civilizations. The pharaoh's capacity to command such organized effort undergirded his reputation as both a powerful ruler and a divine guarantor of order. In the lives of ordinary people, these transformations had mixed consequences. Centralized rule could bring stability, improved irrigation, and access to long-distance goods, but it could also mean heavier demands on labor and tribute. The state's needs shaped daily rhythms, but local community life retained space for older customs and practices, blending new institutions with inherited traditions. The archaeological record records both grand gestures and mundane realities, from inscribed ceremonial palettes to the everyday pots and tools found in domestic refuse. Together, these remains allow us to reconstruct a complex society in which religion, economy, and politics were woven tightly together. The story of Egypt's emergence is thus not a tale of sudden invention but a slow weaving of many strands into a recognizable pattern. By the end of the pre-dynastic and into the early dynastic period, the elements of pharaonic civilization were in place: centralized authority, a sacral king, a bureaucracy, temples and tombs, and a visual and textual language of power. These were not static achievements but living institutions, constantly contested, performed, and renewed by each generation. The birth of the pharaohs was less the miraculous appearance of a single figure than the outcome of countless human choices, technologies, and beliefs converging on the Nile's fertile banks. The legacy of these formative centuries lasted long after the first pharaohs took the double crown. Their innovations in administration, cult, and material culture became templates that later rulers adapted and refined. Even when dynasties rose and fell, the core ideas of kingship, mot, and ritual provision for the dead remained central, anchoring Egyptian civilization across millennia. Studying the transition from pre-dynastic villages to the palace of the pharaoh offers us insight into how complex societies form and consolidate authority. It shows how environmental opportunity, economic surplus, symbolic invention, and social negotiation can collectively produce institutions of great durability. It also reminds us that the image of the ancient pharaoh, so familiar in later monuments, was first forged in modest workshops, village cemeteries, and river settlements where people learned to live together in new, more complicated ways. As you imagine those early scenes, read boats slipping down a silver Nile, craftsmen polishing stone palettes, priests arranging offerings in dim shrines. Sense how ordinary acts accumulated into extraordinary institutions. The first pharaohs were the crystallization of long processes, embodiments of a people's experiment with order and memory. Their emergence is a human story of adaptation, imagination, and the restless invention of meaning along one of the planet's great rivers. Imagine the sun rising over a broad, green ribbon of life threading through a desert that seems endless, and hear the river, steady as a promise. This is the Nile, and it is the heartbeat of ancient Egypt, the reason villages became towns and towns became kingdoms. The Old Kingdom grew from this rhythm, from predictable floods and the people's trust that the world could be ordered into cycles and monuments. When you picture those first kings walking under that unchanging sky, you are seeing the beginning of a particular ambition, to fix a place in eternity. The Old Kingdom, which historians place roughly between the years 2686 and 2181 BCE, stands in our imagination because of stone. Pyramids rising like captured mountains, visible across the centuries. But stone alone does not make a civilization, and so the story begins with people shaping an idea of rule. Pharaohs were more than rulers, they were embodiments of order, an idea both political and spiritual. Their power was expressed through architecture, administration, ritual, and the language of permanence. Before the Grand Pyramids, there were simpler tombs called mastabas, flat-roofed rectangles of mud brick lining cemeteries beside the Nile. These structures held offering rooms and false doors where the living could interact with the deceased spirit, called the Ka. Over time, the elite sought greater security and visibility for the Ka, and those longings produced experiments in stone, layers upon layers of innovation that culminated in the stepped and smooth-sided pyramids we now recognize. Each new form answered a set of anxieties about death, memory, and divine continuity. One of the most pivotal figures in this architectural revolution was a man known as Djoser, a third dynasty king who commissioned a complex at Saqqara that changed funerary architecture forever. His tomb began as a mastaba and, through the vision of an architect named Imhotep, rose into the world's first large-scale stone building, the Step Pyramid. Here was not just a tomb but a whole ceremonial landscape, with courtyards and shrines and walls that turned the king's burial into a staged journey toward divinity. The Step Pyramid signaled that kingship would be expressed in stone and spectacle, and that the state could marshal labor and resources for a single monument. From the success at Saqqara came bold ambitions and new techniques, and those innovations gathered force in the Fourth Dynasty under kings whose names still echo: Sneferu, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. Sneferu, in particular, was an experimenter. He tried several pyramid forms at Mitam and Dashur before achieving success with what we call the Red Pyramid. His restless program of building demonstrated that kingship could be asserted through a sequence of public works, and that mastery over stone could become a language of authority. Each pyramid site carried a complex of temples and causeways and workers' settlements that made the building itself into an ongoing economic engine. At Giza, the scale is almost hard to comprehend. The Pyramid of Khufu, which we call the Great Pyramid, is not simply large, it is engineered with astonishing precision for its time, oriented to the cardinal points and built from millions of blocks whose weight and placement invited generations of questions. The process required a supply chain, quarries for limestone and granite, crews to cut and move blocks, teams to lay foundations and align passages. But it also required an administrative heart to plan years ahead, to allocate grain and clothing and housing for laborers, and to keep records that would ensure work continued across seasons and rains. Those records, when they survive, tell a different story than the one that imagines endless conscripted slaves. Excavations around the Giza Plateau have unearthed worker villages, bakeries, breweries, and medical evidence of care, showing skilled laborers who lived in organized communities and were provisioned by the state. Graffiti left by teams of craftsmen and the burials of workers indicate pride and social identity. These builders were not anonymous victims but participants in a shared project that bound them to the king's agenda. Seasonal labor, often aligned with the Nile's flood cycle that halted farm work, allowed a large workforce to be mobilized without destroying agricultural life. Yet even as the Old Kingdom depended on cooperation, it depended more deeply on an ideology that fused the ruler with divine forces. The king was the living Horus, a sky god manifest on earth, and upon death he became identified with Osiris, lord of the afterlife. This dual identity gave a sacred logic to the construction of monuments. A pyramid was a tool for resurrection, a machine crafted so the king could ascend into the sun's realm and join the eternal order. Rituals performed daily in the mortuary temples were not mere ceremonies, they were mechanisms to sustain the king's ka and, by extension, the cosmic balance known as Mat. To sustain such a system, the Old Kingdom organized a formidable bureaucracy that is visible in stone, in papyrus fragments, and in the inscriptions placed in tombs by viziers and scribes. A vizier, the pharaoh's chief official, oversaw the courts, the granaries, and the fleets. Beneath him, a network of overseers, tax collectors, and craftsmen turned policy into practice. Egypt was divided into nomes, administrative districts each with its governors and local administrators, and this division allowed the central government to extract resources while also relying on local elites. The relationship between center and periphery was delicate, and it depended on mutual advantage. The king needed taxes, labor, and loyalty, while local elites wanted honor, office, and access to royal favor. Trade and contact beyond Egypt's borders supplemented what the Nile provided. Expeditions crossed the eastern deserts to the Red Sea and Sinai for copper and turquoise, and farther afield, traders reached into Nubia and the Levant for gold, timber, incense, and other luxuries. These contacts were not merely economic, they were political gestures that projected Egyptian power and opened channels for cultural exchange. Artisans adapted foreign materials, and the royal prestige increased with every new object brought back, each one a token of reach and influence. Religion shaped daily life and statecraft in ways we might miss if we only focus on stone. Temples and cults created rhythms that organized the year, festivals, offerings, and the naming of time after ritual events. The solar cult of Ra, which grew in importance during the Old Kingdom, fused with kingship in a special way. Many pharaohs adopted names that emphasized their relationship with the sun, seeing their reigns as reflections of the sun's journey across the sky. The pyramid itself, with its triangular faces mirroring solar rays, became an architectural metaphor for that celestial connection. Art from the Old Kingdom reflects this religious and political logic through a distinctive visual language, calm, formal, and idealized. Statues of kings sit rigid, bodies carved to embody eternal youth and ordered proportion, faces smoothed into an expression that balances humanity with divinity. Reliefs inside tombs capture scenes of daily life, agricultural tasks, hunting, and craft production, not as mere decoration but as spells of representation intended to animate the tomb's owner in the next world. The precision of figural art was an economy of meaning. A few strokes or planes could signify role, status, and the moral order the king maintained. The material techniques behind these images were as technical as any pyramid plan. Stone carvers worked with copper chisels and dolerite pounding stones to shape harder blocks, while artisans mixed pigments from minerals to paint reliefs and statues. Jewelers hammered gold, inlaid stone, and threaded faience beads with a dexterity that required workshops and apprenticeships. Technologies of craft were passed along in households and guilds. Knowledge was conserved in practical training rather than abstract manuals, though occasional inscriptions do record instructions and lists. This apprenticeship model created a steady stream of skilled labor capable of executing royal and elite commissions. The mortuary complex of a king was a small city devoted to his eternal sustenance. A pyramid sat at the heart, but it was surrounded by a valley temple near the Nile, a causeway linking to a mortuary temple, and sometimes subsidiary pyramids and mastabas for queens and officials. Priests maintained daily rituals to feed the king's ka through offerings of bread, beer, and incense, and these rites required grain stored in granaries, cattle for sacrificial meat, and boats to transport goods. The economic burden of maintaining a king's cult continued long after his death, becoming a powerful force in shaping the state's priorities and resource allocations. As we explore deeper into the Old Kingdom's institutions, the royal titulary emerges as an important tool in crafting royal identity. A pharaoh bore 5 names, each expressing a facet of his role. The Horus name linked him to the sky god, the throne name asserted his political sovereignty, and other names invoked the protective and creative impulses of gods and ancestors. These names were not idle poetry, they were declarations of authority, meant to be spoken and inscribed in temples and stelae, to seal legal acts and to be invoked in prayers. Names, like monuments, outlived mortal bodies and kept kings present in the ritual landscape. But power, even when sanctified, travels on practical means. The state's ability to move stone depended on an infrastructure of roads, quarries, sledges, and specially organized crews. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated clever solutions. A wetting of the desert beneath sledges reduces friction, teams of men and rollers could move blocks, and river transport allowed heavy granite to travel from Aswan to Giza. The coordination of these elements, material, human, and administrative, is what made pyramids possible. They were not the work of a single genius, but the achievement of an organized society mobilizing knowledge, muscle, and faith. The interior of pyramids tells a story of architectural risk and religious imagination. Burial chambers were often cut from hard stone and placed in the heart of the monument, sometimes with complex passageways and false corridors designed to confuse tomb robbers. In certain pyramids, such as those of the later Old Kingdom, we see elaborate decorative programs that include inscribed spells meant to protect and revive the king. The engineering choices, whether to place a chamber at ground level or deep within the core, reveal a balancing act between accessibility for cult and security in the afterlife. Yet security proved to be an ever-present concern. Tomb robbery was not a problem of modern imagination alone, it was a real threat throughout Egyptian history, and the state enacted laws and punishments to deter those who would plunder the dead. Officials tried to keep locations secret, built blocking stones, and wrote spells into tombs that threatened divine retribution. Despite these measures, economic hardship, political instability, and the lure of precious goods sometimes overcame fear of divine punishment, and tombs were routinely violated in troubled times. The Old Kingdom's political life also played out through the careers of powerful officials whose tombs anthropologically rivaled the king's smaller complexes. Viziers and high priests carved rock-cut tombs with elaborate scenes showing their accomplishments, shipments they oversaw, and the bureaucratic apparatus they managed. These elite tombs remind us that power was distributed, and that the skills of administration had to be rewarded with status, office, and burial privileges. The elite's visual claims to service and piety helped legitimize the system and created a culture where service to the king became the path to prestige. Cultural continuity in the Old Kingdom was remarkable, but so was change. Over generations, the balance between royal power and provincial autonomy shifted, sometimes imperceptibly. Nomarchs, the governors of nomes, gained wealth and local authority through control of land and resources, and as their families entrenched themselves, the central government's ability to command them waxed and waned. This is a familiar tension in any large state. Central policy must be implemented locally, and local actors will leverage their positions to secure advantage. The story of the Old Kingdom's decline is in large part the story of how that balance once upheld slowly disintegrated. Environmental factors also played a role in the kingdom's arc. The Nile's floods were central to agricultural success, and variations in inundation could lead to lean years and social strain. Archaeological and paleoclimatic evidence suggests that episodic droughts or changes in Nile behavior may have stressed the economy, especially when combined with the heavy fiscal demands of long, expensive royal projects. When food stores dwindled and taxes could not be paid in usual ways, the social contract that bound people to the divine king frayed. Food shortages could turn ritual obligations into heavy burdens, breeding unrest. Long rains could be both a blessing and a curse. A long-lived king like Pepi II, who is said to have reigned into extreme old age, left an ambiguous legacy. Continuity could mean stability, but extended time on the throne also meant that institutions aged and the machinery of governance could ossify. Successive succession crises or weak heirs could open the door to power struggles, and the concentration of wealth in local centers sometimes encouraged regionalism. The result was a slow hollowing out of centralized authority, exacerbated by the costs that perpetual royal cults imposed on the economy. Another internal pressure came from the very projects that made the Old Kingdom famous. Pyramids and temples required enormous resources to build and, crucially, to maintain. Each mortuary cult demanded food, workers, and ritual supplies across decades and centuries, and as more kings constructed grand monuments, the burden multiplied. The state's redirection of surplus to sustain these cults could crowd out investment in other public goods like irrigation repair, which had direct impacts on agricultural productivity. Thus, architectural splendor fed a cycle that could ultimately undermine the society that produced it. Language and writing were instruments of administration and of belief. Hieroglyphs inscribed on stone and written on papyrus recorded decrees, lists of rations, and the ritual formulas that powered cults. Scribes were a privileged caste with specialized training, responsible for keeping accounts and memorializing achievements. The act of inscription was itself a technology of power. To carve a name into stone was to assert presence across time, to bind a memory into the landscape in a way that oral speech alone could not accomplish. The funerary texts that survive from the end of the Old Kingdom hint at evolving religious thought. The pyramid texts, inscribed in the tombs of kings like Unas in the 5th dynasty, are a remarkable collection of spells and declarations intended to ensure the king's ascent and transformation. These texts move beyond simple offerings and begin to describe metaphysical journeys and cosmic roles for the ruler. Their emergence suggests a deepening of theological complexity, where kingship is conceptualized not only as statecraft but as participation in cosmic cycles with specific verbal formulas to guarantee success. Not every district or social actor benefited equally from the Old Kingdom's achievements. Women's roles were diverse. Queens and royal mothers held positions of ceremonial and sometimes political import, evidenced by queenly burials and titles. Elite women could own property, manage affairs, and influence succession, though the material record inevitably privileges men in official positions. Among the non-elite, women participated in household economies, crafts, and ritual, and their contributions to daily sustenance, spinning, baking, caring, undergirded the entire system. The relationship with neighboring lands was complex and often pragmatic. In Nubia to the south, Egypt pursued both trade and control, driven by the lure of gold and other resources. Military expeditions, trading outposts, and diplomatic gifts created a web of interaction that fed the Egyptian economy while extending its cultural horizon. The Sinai and the Levant supplied minerals and wood, and these imports shaped artistic practice and practical technology. Egypt, although resource-rich in certain essentials, depended on networks to supply what its environment lacked. Religion and art fused in the funerary landscapes that dotted the desert edges of the Nile, where tomb walls become stages showing a world the deceased would inhabit. Scenes of harvest and hunting were not mere recollections but conjurations, spells meant to provide food and activity in the afterlife. Offering lists carved by the hand of a scribe promised a steady stream of provisions, while sculpted figures served as stand-ins for the dead to perform labor through magical substitution. This interweaving of magic and administration made the household of the dead an extension of the living economy. The iconography of royal power, crowns, scepters, ceremonial beard, and the royal kilt packed meanings familiar to the contemporary Egyptian: legitimacy, conquest, fertility, and continuity. A king's headdress was a visual contract, a set of signs that told subjects who had the right to command. Inscriptions paired these images with titles and epithets to reinforce authority, both for the nearby populace and for posterity. Such material culture made the abstract principle of order sensible and visible to a people who lived in a world where signs and rituals mattered. Education and knowledge transmission were organized around households and temple schools, where boys of elite families learned to write and calculate. The ability to read and record was a path to bureaucratic office, and the mastery of administrative practices shaped careers and social mobility. The oral training of artisans and the portability of craft techniques ensured that knowledge could be transferred across generations even when formal schooling was limited. This blend of formal and informal education created a resilient culture of skills. Medicine and care in Old Kingdom settlements reveal surprising sophistication within their frameworks. Tomb depictions and skeletal evidence show practitioners who knew how to set bones, treat wounds, and manage infections with poultices and bandages. Bones with healed fractures tell a story of attentive care, and textual references speak to named practitioners who served in palaces and temples. While medical theory was interwoven with religious belief, practical healing was often pragmatic and capable of remarkable success given the resources at hand. Music, poetry, and ritual performance were essential threads in the social fabric. Hymns to gods, songs for funerary rites, and instrumental accompaniment enlivened both temple life and private celebrations. Music was functional as well as aesthetic. Rhythm and song structured labor, sustained rituals, and affirmed communal identity. Instruments like harps and flutes and percussion came in multiple forms, and professional musicians held respected positions within temple networks and courtly households. As the Old Kingdom matured, so did urban and rural architecture beyond the royal necropolises. Towns displayed planned streets, storage facilities, and workshops, while villages exhibited household units adapted to local climate and resources. Storage silos and granaries demonstrate that food security was a technical problem addressed by design and policy, and the maintenance of these stores tied local communities into the broader fiscal systems of the state. This architecture of provision was as central to power as any temple or pyramid. One of the most arresting features of Old Kingdom material culture is the funerary portrait, a statue or painted face meant to fix identity against the eroding touch of time. These images were not neutral likenesses, they were deliberate reconstructions intended to capture the individual's role, status, and moral presence. In some cases, the temper of expression in these portraits suggests personal qualities we can almost imagine: a steward's steady gaze, a scribe's concentrated purpose, a noblewoman's composed dignity. They are invitations to empathize across millennia. Piety and the politics of the Old Kingdom were entwined in the daily bread and beer offered in temple courtyards. Priests, who served the mortuary cults, held offices that were often administrative as well as spiritual, managing estates and coordinating labor. The office of priest thus became another avenue into power and wealth, and the particularities of these offices could become hereditary, much like nomarchies. Where religious offices concentrated economic control, they could rival other branches of power, complicating the state's attempts to maintain monopoly over prestige and wealth. Law and order were expressed through decrees and the visible authority of officials who issued commands, oversaw works, and judged disputes. The legal sphere was grounded in customary principles and the practical needs of adjudicating claims over land, labor, and goods. While we do not possess a full code from the Old Kingdom, extant documents suggest a legal consciousness attentive to contracts, inheritance, and the obligations of office. In this sense, law was not only punishment but a structure for predictable exchange and the reinforcement of social roles. The craftspeople of the Old Kingdom developed materials and aesthetics that influenced societies beyond Egypt. Their faience, a glazed non-clay ceramic, shone like turquoise and was used for beads and amulets. Its production demonstrated sophisticated control of firing and chemical processes. Woodworking, though challenged by scarcity of Nile timber, achieved remarkable finesse when luxury would arrive by trade, and inlay techniques gave furniture and coffins an appearance of opulence. These crafts circulated in diplomatic gifts and funerary equipment, amplifying Egypt's cultural presence abroad. Pyramid texts and royal hymns did more than instruct the dead. They forged a narrative of kingship that would persist long after the Old Kingdom's political center faltered. The idea of the king as a mediator between heaven and earth, a dispenser of justice and order, remained a cultural touchstone. Later dynasties looked back to Old Kingdom precedents for models of royal behavior and burial, and the enduring memory of that age shaped how later Egyptians imagined their golden past. Archaeological work continues to reshape our understanding of the Old Kingdom, as new discoveries reveal the lives of ordinary people who built and sustained the monuments that dominate modern imagination. Excavations of worker cemeteries, settlements, and food production sites have emphasized that the pyramids were collective achievements rooted in everyday toil and ritual. This newer focus humanizes the story, reminding us that each block of stone bore the fingerprint of an individual hand, that the songs of workers and the smell of bread rose alongside the dust of building. Over time, the pressures of economics, administration, environment, and local ambition conspired to make central authority fragile. The Old Kingdom did not end with a single event, but with a fraying of institutions and a slow reconfiguration of power on a regional basis. In the decades after the Sixth Dynasty, Egypt entered a period historians call the First Intermediate Period, a time of political fragmentation, contested legitimacy, and local rule. The monuments remained, a testament to earlier unity, but their capacity to organize society's labor and loyalty had been diminished. Even as the centralized authority waned, the cultural practices and religious ideas developed in the Old Kingdom did not vanish. They were transmitted, adapted, and sometimes transformed by the political actors of the Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom who sought to claim the prestige of the past. The pyramids themselves continued to be places of pilgrimage and reference, and the language of kingship forged in that era became the grammar later rulers used to legitimize their authority. Thus, decline and legacy intertwined in complex ways. When we stand before an Old Kingdom monument today, or simply hear about it on a long drive, we are participating in a conversation stretching back 4.5 millennia. Those stones speak of labor and devotion, administrative invention and religious imagination, of a people who thought the world could be set in place with ritual and ledger and sand and mortar. The pyramids are not merely tombs, they are arguments about permanence, declarations of human confidence against time's erosion. As you consider all this, remember that the Old Kingdom's achievements rested on everyday choices: how to store grain, how to organize teams, how to sing while pulling a load across sand, how to teach a child to write a name that would last. These small acts, repeated, accumulated power and memory, and made a civilization that shaped the world's heritage. The grandeur of the pyramids is matched by the quiet persistence of those who fed, carved, measured, and prayed. Finally, the story of the Old Kingdom is alive because it invites us to think about what it means to build for eternity. Those rulers sought certainty in stone. They invested in rituals designed to make death a passage rather than an end. The paradox is that in pursuing permanence, they created fragile systems that required constant attention. Their legacy is both a monument to human aspiration and a cautionary tale about the costs of ordering a society around the cult of one ruler. So when the sun crosses the windshield and the road stretches on, imagine the hands that lifted blocks from quarries, the scribes who recorded rations by candlelight, the priests who arranged bread offerings at dawn. Picture a river that taught a people how to measure time through floods and fed an economy that could build mountains from stone. The Old Kingdom was not merely a time of kings and pyramids. It was a complex, living network of belief, labor, ingenuity, and the tireless human desire to be remembered. The Middle Kingdom of ancient Egypt opens like a long inhale after a time of fracture, a breath that reunited a land that had drifted into competing centers and uncertain loyalties. The First Intermediate Period had loosened the threads that once tied Upper and Lower Egypt together, and out of that looseness came the slow, deliberate work of reweaving. Reunification was not a single dramatic event but a series of political and military moves, marriages, and ideological shifts that restored an idea as much as a state, the pharaoh as the guarantor of Ma'at, the cosmic order. In the life of the nation, biography mattered. Mentuhotep II, a king of the 11th dynasty based in Thebes, stands at the center of this return to unity. His campaigns against rival rulers in the north culminated in the submission of Heracleopolis, and more than victory, his reign offered a renewed model of kingship that blended military authority with ritual renewal. The funerary complex of Mentuhotep II at Deir el-Bahri is both a monument and a manifesto. Built in terraces that descend toward the Nile Valley, it reimagined royal architecture and inserted the living pharaoh into the landscape of his ancestors. Visitors, or the workers who walked its ramps, would have felt the intimacy of a god-king who could inhabit both field and throne. But reunification required more than a charismatic ruler. It required administrative imagination. The military successes of Thebes were followed by reorganizing the bureaucracy that had withered during the unstable years. Names and titles were standardized, the office of the vizier regained prominence, and a renewed network of scribes and officials began to knit together taxation, conscription, and jurisdiction across nomes. From the moment of reunification, the rulers of the Middle Kingdom treated the Nile as both artery and instrument. River control meant food security, and food security meant the stability necessary for cultural work. Irrigation projects were revived and expanded with greater ambition, and the management of canals and basin systems received renewed attention in royal records. The move of the political center from Thebes to a new capital in the north is one of the era's subtler shifts. Amenemhat, the founder of the 12th dynasty, established Ichtawi somewhere near the Fayum and the Memphite area, creating a political pivot that could better oversee both Delta and Upper Egypt. That shift shows how ruling strategies adapted to geography, making the administration more responsive to the needs of a growing state. Amenemhat's own story carries the texture of the period. Possibly a former official who rose to the highest station, he fashioned his legitimacy through both lineage and invention. He emphasized the continuity of kingship while also introducing innovations, including co-regency, which would help smooth transitions of power. His inscriptions frame his ascent as divinely sanctioned, tying personal ambition to the cosmic restoration of Ma'at. The 12th dynasty that followed became the golden spine of the Middle Kingdom, and its kings transformed modest reunification into lasting prosperity. Senusret I and Senusret III, Amenemhat II and Amenemhat III, among others, consolidated borders, reformed institutions, and patronized an outpouring of cultural production. The kingdom's heartbeat quickened with projects that were both practical and symbolic: fortresses, canals, temple restorations, and royal tombs. Fortress building along the southern frontier was an unmistakable sign of a state confident in its reach and anxious about its margins. In Nubia, the Middle Kingdom erected a chain of fortifications, mud brick and stone complexes that held military garrisons and customs posts. These forts were not merely defensive, they were instruments of economic control, regulating gold mining, trade, and the flow of people in and out of the Sudanese lands. Along those borders, Egyptian power met a world rich in resources and complexity. Kush offered gold and ebony, and the desert corridors opened to Punt, from which luxury goods like incense and exotic animals came. Trade was both matter and message. Shipments of cedar, copper, and lapis lazuli arrived as evidence that the Middle Kingdom was plugged into networks of exchange that stretched across the Red Sea and into the Levant. The military was no longer just levied manpower called up for single campaigns. It became more professional and more permanent. Soldiers were garrisoned in frontier forts and tasked with policing trade routes and suppressing rebellions. Their presence shaped the lives of border regions and created new avenues for interaction, marriage, local alliances, and shared customs that left traces in material culture. In the Nile heartland, agricultural reforms made an immense difference in ordinary lives. Canal works, reservoir management, and the promotion of the Fayum as arable land expanded the state's capacity to feed, tax, and support a growing urban culture. When irrigation succeeded, harvests swelled, and the state could store surpluses that would fund voyages, build temples, and sustain craftsmen. That economic backbone allowed artisans and writers to flourish. The Middle Kingdom is famous for its literature, which reaches a psychological depth and moral reflection unseen before. Tales like the story of Sinew explore exile, identity, and return. The instructions of Amenemhat probe the precariousness of power, and fragments of love poetry and wisdom literature reveal an age of conversation across classes. These works matter because they are intimate, human texts that complicate our image of ancient rulers as simply autocrats. Sinu's melancholy and introspection turn him into a protagonist who thinks, doubts, and longs, qualities that would feel familiar to listeners in any era. Because literature was being copied and taught in scribal schools, these themes circulated and shaped the ethical imagination of bureaucrats, priests, and merchants. Scribal culture itself became a vehicle for social mobility and control. The training of young men in writing and accounting was intensive and ritualized, involving the mastery of hieratic script and the memorization of canonical texts. A skilled scribe could climb the administrative ladder and serve in tax offices, archives, or provincial courts, and his pen helped translate royal policy into everyday governance. The administrative archives of the Middle Kingdom show a state that was impressively organized. The central government collected and redistributed grain, managed corvée labor needed for the king's projects, and oversaw the appointment of local officials. We glimpse that world in papyri that record labor drafts, tax lists, and even personal complaints, revealing the texture of civic life. Art in the Middle Kingdom reveals a new emphasis on realism and psychological presence. Sculptors carved faces with individualized features and a gravity that suggests character as much as status. The so-called block statues, figures squatting with knees drawn and cloak wrapped tight, convey contemplative stillness, a new type of monument that seems designed for both durability and intimacy. Private tombs from this period also display a surge of artistic attention and religious innovation. The tombs at Beni Hassan are rich with vivid wall paintings, scenes of daily life, agriculture, hunting, and craftsmen capture motion and detail with a confident hand. Portraiture and the depiction of provincial scenes indicate a cultural confidence that celebrated regional identities even as it tied them to a national narrative. Religious practice, meanwhile, began to shift toward personal piety and the promise of an afterlife that was more accessible to ordinary people. Where once elaborate royal rituals dominated the religious imagination, the Middle Kingdom disseminated funerary spells and personalized expressions of hope. Coffin texts, an evolution of the earlier pyramid texts, spread protective formulas beyond the tombs of kings and opened doors for the broader population. Osiris rose as a central figure in funerary thought during these centuries, becoming the guarantor of resurrection and the model for moral judgment in the afterlife. That development changed how people thought of death and of ethical life, linking good conduct with the hope of rebirth. Rituals and spells became tools both for kings and for private citizens who wanted to secure a place beyond death. Medicine and science advanced in practical ways that touched everyday existence. Physicians compiled remedies and surgical notes on papyri, showing a mixture of empirical observation and magical incantation. Mathematics and engineering, too, found practical application in the survey of fields, measurement of architectural plans, and calculation of grain rations, making administrative precision possible. The Middle Kingdom's architecture married functionality with ideology. Temples were rebuilt and enlarged, often aligning with older sacred sites to claim continuity with ancient gods. Stone became a favored medium for public works, replacing perishable materials and making monuments that would survive the desert's slow erasures. Royal building projects were not simply acts of glory, they were declarations of care. When a pharaoh diverted labor to restore a temple or dig a canal, he presented himself as the steward who maintained cosmic balance. Laborers who set stones or carved reliefs performed a civic ritual just as meaningful as a priest's recitation, and the kingdom's cohesion depended on that shared sense of purpose. Trade with the Levant and maritime ventures across the Red Sea expanded Egypt's reach and cosmopolitanism. Traders brought new raw materials and new ideas, and Egyptian craftsmen adapted foreign motifs into a local idiom. The cosmopolitan corridors of exchange made cities into nodes of cultural hybridity where goods, languages, and beliefs mingled. Within households, daily life displayed both continuity with the past and new levels of complexity. Families lived in homes of mud brick with courtyards, practiced agriculture, and maintained domestic shrines for household gods. The existence of personal letters and accounts shows that people negotiated marriage, debt, and property with the same human concerns that have animated societies across time. Women's roles in the Middle Kingdom revealed both constraint and agency. While official power remained largely male-dominated, women could own property, manage estates, and, in some cases, hold prestigious titles. Royal women in particular acted as patrons and ritual figures, their images carved in stone and invoked in temple inscriptions. Mortuary architecture reached a new technical and symbolic complexity in this era. Pyramids were still built, but the engineering methods changed: cores of mud brick capped by stone, complex substructures, and elaborate causeways created funerary complexes that attempted to secure the king's eternal life without repeating the scale of the Old Kingdom monuments. Cemeteries clustered near the Nile and reflected a renewed investment in rites of passage. At the same time, royal tombs and the private funerary landscape transformed social memory. Elite tombs were decorated with autobiographical inscriptions celebrating a man's career, his generosity, and his piety, which linked familial reputation to the state's moral order. Tomb owners curated the story they wanted to survive, and artisans executed those narratives with care. One of the Middle Kingdom's quietly revolutionary shifts was the emphasis on provincial power as complementary rather than antagonistic to royal authority. Local officials rose to prominence by demonstrating loyalty to the crown while managing regional needs. This balance preserved local traditions and allowed the central government to reach into the countryside with fewer frictions. That balance, however, required constant maintenance. Corruption, local resistance, and the difficulties of communication posed ongoing challenges. The state addressed these issues with a mixture of legal reforms, surveillance through appointed officials, and ritual demonstrations of royal oversight. The sight of a royal courier passing through a nome, or of an inspection by a royal scribe, reinforced the notion of an integrated polity. The royal cult grew more sophisticated in its use of symbolism. Pharaohs adopted elaborate titulary and presented themselves as shepherds of people, defenders of boundaries, and builders of temples. Their inscriptions balanced humility before the gods with an assertion of divine favor, creating an image of rulership that was both ambivalent and commanding. In Nubia and the southern reaches, the relationship with local polities ranged from cooperative trade to direct administration. Egyptian governors established administrative centers and extracted tribute, but they also facilitated the exchange of goods and technologies. The integration of Nubia was not merely conquest, it became a long-term relationship that altered both Egyptian and Nubian trajectories. Meanwhile, the Delta and the eastern frontiers were arenas of diplomacy and periodic conflict. The Middle Kingdom engaged with Aegean and Levantine peoples through trade, mercenary service, and occasional military expeditions. Fortified towns along the frontier monitored movement and served as contact points for the exchange of culture and commodities. Religious innovation in the Middle Kingdom included not only the spread of funerary spells but also the personalization of worship. Private chapels, votive offerings, and the liturgical use of hymns allowed more people to participate in devotional life. That spiritual democratization had the effect of making gods feel nearer even as the pharaoh maintained his unique mediating role. Pharaonic ideology during this era sharpened the image of the king as a pragmatic administrator. Royal inscriptions celebrate canal diggers, road builders, and the men who moved stone and grain, an emphasis that frames kingship as active governance rather than abstract divinity. This rhetoric helped explain why the state had a right to command labor, and it presented public works as expressions of paternal care. The Middle Kingdom also refined the bureaucratic language of contracts, petitions, and decrees. Ordinary people petitioned the king or local officials in writing, asking for redress or favor, and those petitions survived to reveal a legal culture in which appeals to justice were meaningful. The written word became both a technical tool and a moral instrument. Commerce and craft flourished together. Workshops produced stone vessels, metalwork, and delicate faience that showed both technical mastery and aesthetic innovation. The market for luxury goods fed by royal and elite demand helped sustain specialized artisans and supported a visible display of wealth that reinforced social hierarchies. Education and the training of elites relied on institutions we call schools, but that were as much familial as institutional. Boys and young men learned hieratic writing and arithmetic in places attached to temples or administrative centers, and their curriculum included model texts that transmitted literary, religious, and legal traditions. Those schools acted as engines of cultural continuity, ensuring that the language and values of the center flowed to outlying regions. The Middle Kingdom's sculpture and relief work convey an increased attention to emotion and age. Pharaohs were sometimes portrayed with lines of worry, a realism that suggests a ruler burdened by responsibility rather than untouched by human frailty. That sensibility made royal images more resonant for ordinary people who could see governance as a human undertaking. Architecture and urban planning show the state's ambitions to provide infrastructure as a statement of care. Planned towns and workmen's villages surrounding quarries and temples indicate a level of logistical competence. Workers were organized into crews, fed from state granaries, and their lives were embedded within a system that tied labor to national projects. Textiles, jewelry, and tomb goods from the Middle Kingdom demonstrate both continuity with earlier styles and regional variation. Craftsmen in different nomes adapted fashions and materials to local tastes, but the pull of royal fashion is evident in patterns and motifs that recur in art across the kingdom. Personal adornment served as a language of status and devotion. Language itself was a vehicle of identity and authority. Hieroglyphs continued to mark monumental inscriptions, while hieratic script handled the practical demands of business and private communication. The coexistence of these scripts created a layered literacy that could speak in awe at temple walls and in detail in the ledger books of granaries. Women appear in documents as managers of property, beneficiaries of wills, and sometimes as landholders, showing that legal structures allowed female agency within certain bounds. Elite women could sponsor building works or hold religious offices that gave them public visibility, and princesses married into diplomacy, sealing bonds between ruling houses. Their lives were not merely domestic, they mattered to the state's social fabric. Religious festivals became public spectacles that reinforced community bonds. Seasonal rites, processions, and temple feasts drew people together in coordinated celebration, binding citizens to the agricultural calendar and to the gods who regulated it. The state's sponsorship of festivals was a means of dramatizing its role as provider and protector. Theological texts grew richer and more complex, reflecting debates and innovations among priests and scribes. Hymns to gods, ritual manuals, and funerary spells were copied, commented upon, and adapted, showing an intellectual community engaged in preserving and interpreting tradition. That theological conversation kept religious life dynamic and responsive to new social realities. Middle Kingdom kings also undertook expeditions into the Sinai to extract copper and turquoise, and into the eastern desert for gold and building stone. Those expeditions were logistical triumphs involving organized labor, supply chains, and careful planning. The records of routes and provisions give us a picture of an administration capable of projecting power into difficult terrain. Economic records from the period show a sophisticated fiscal system handling yields from different regions. Grain was stored in granaries for times of scarcity, redistributed as wages for labor, or exported as part of diplomatic gifts. The state's management of resources shaped both urban and rural life, ensuring the machinery of government could run steadily. The Middle Kingdom's art and literature also reveal a broadened sense of empathy. Stories probe the interior life of people from different social backgrounds, and the visual arts portray a diversity of occupations and activities. That attention to human variety created a sense that the nation's identity was a tapestry of many lives woven together by the state. One cannot speak of cultural flourishing without mentioning funerary innovation that made the afterlife a subject of popular imagination. People invested in tomb goods, spells, and mummification practices with the belief that careful ritual could secure their passage. The democratization of afterlife spells turned the personal future into a matter of elaborate preparation, often involving specialists and expensive goods. Despite the state's successes, the Middle Kingdom faced persistent challenges. Natural cycles of flood and drought could unsettle carefully balanced economies, and rival powers in the Near East and the South could complicate trade and diplomacy. The state responded through policy, military action, and religious appeals, but uncertainty remained a fact of life. Internal tensions sometimes surfaced in the harsh realities of governance. Tax burdens and corvée labor could provoke complaint, and letters survived that record petitions and grievances. The state's legitimacy depended on its ability to respond to such issues in ways that maintained the perception of fairness and order. As the 12th dynasty progressed, some rulers, Senusret III in particular, exercised strong personal authority while also implementing more systematic governance. Senusret III is remembered for both military vigor and administrative reforms that strengthened royal oversight of the provinces. His portraiture is striking, a stern, lined face that broadcasts the image of a ruler unafraid to act decisively. Amenemhat III's reign is often associated with economic prosperity and extraordinary building projects, including developments at the Fayum and the construction of elaborate royal tombs. Water control projects in the Fayum transformed marshland into productive estates and created a new agricultural heartland that helped sustain the population. His era is one of remarkable state-sponsored investment in infrastructure and agricultural expansion. The end of the 12th dynasty and the early 13th centuries brought strains that the system could not entirely absorb. Succession disputes, the stresses of long-term resource management, and external pressures contributed to a slow unraveling. By the time of the Second Intermediate Period, the coherent state of the Middle Kingdom would splinter, leaving behind monuments and texts that spoke of what had been achieved. Yet the legacy of the Middle Kingdom would outlast its political decline. Stylistically and intellectually, the period set patterns that New Kingdom pharaohs would later adapt and build upon. The literature, administrative practices, and religious innovations persisted in cultural memory and were reactivated in later revivals. The Middle Kingdom's cultural sway reached into time as a standard of good governance and artistic achievement. Later Egyptians looked back at Amenemhat and Senusret as exemplars of rulership and drew inspiration from the age when kings balanced building projects with the care of their people. The era became a script that future rulers could read and reinterpret in their own terms. When we imagine life in a Middle Kingdom city, we see bustling streets, markets, and workshops where goods were exchanged and news circulated. A craftsman might walk from his house to a workshop, passing priests chanting at a small shrine, children learning to write, and officials posting decrees. That urban fabric embodied a society where public and private life interlocked in ways both practical and ceremonial. Music and performance were part of daily expression, with instruments and songs accompanying both labor and leisure. Professional musicians performed in temples and private estates, setting ritual texts to melody or enlivening feasts with rhythm. The arts were woven into social life, not sequestered in elite spaces but present in the cadence of communal ritual. Funerary banquets and commemorative rituals helped maintain family memory and social cohesion. These events reinforced obligations between the living and the dead, often involving offerings, recitations, and communal meals that bound kin and community together. Memory itself was a social practice, maintained through ritualized repetition. The Middle Kingdom's craftsmen also left behind exquisite small objects that tell us about taste and technique. Ivory inlays, finely carved amulets, and inlaid jewelry indicate both a high level of skill and a market for refined goods. These objects were inlaid with foreign materials and local stones, suggesting the circulation of luxury items and the status they conferred. On the edge of empire, cultural exchange was a daily occurrence. Merchants and envoys brought stories, fashions, and technical know-how, while Egyptian practices spread into neighboring regions. This interchange gradually produced hybrid forms of art, language, and ritual that attest to the fluidity of cultural boundaries. By focusing on texts like the autobiographies carved into rock and stone, we capture the voices of provincial elites who defined themselves through service to the king. These men and women narrated careers that mixed military service, administrative skill, and piety, producing a record of personal virtue that aligned with the state's interests. Their memorials are intimate windows into the aspirations and anxieties of the time. As the Middle Kingdom matured, it cultivated a sense of historical self-consciousness. Inscriptions invoked past kings and deities to authorize present deeds, and chronicles, though fragmentary, sought to place contemporary achievements in a long arc of continuity. That memory politics helped stabilize the present by anchoring it to an honored past. Education's role in social reproduction cannot be overstated. Literacy was a gatekeeper and a ladder. Those who could write could move through administrative ranks and help shape policy. The textual tradition of the Middle Kingdom is therefore not just aesthetic but practical, a corpus that sustained governance by training minds to think bureaucratically and morally. The end of the Middle Kingdom was not a sudden collapse, but a thinning of capacity, where centralized control loosened and regional players took advantage. The arrival of foreign elements, such as the Hyksos and the Delta, reflects a world in which mobility could alter political configurations. Yet even as the political superstructure decayed, cultural practices persisted, ready to be recomposed by later builders of empire. Looking back from 1,000 years beyond that era, the Middle Kingdom appears as an age of repair and creativity, a time when Egypt's rulers and citizens sought to bind what had been broken and to make something enduring. Their projects, temples, canals, literature, and law, were not merely monuments to power but instruments for living well under the sun and for making a world that could be remembered. The Middle Kingdom thus deserves to be heard not as a distant museum case, but as a living chapter in a longer human story. Its mixture of centralized ambition and local activity, its literary richness, and its technical achievements illuminate how societies rebuild and renew themselves. As monuments erode and texts fade, what endures is the sense of striving, to build, to govern wisely, and to imagine a future beyond one's own life. And when we listen to the Middle Kingdom's echoes, we recognize the rhythms of human governance, the labor of artisans and scribes, the anxieties of rulers, and the small, steady things that make civilizations possible. The Nile's flow carried grain and stones, but it also carried stories, songs, and laws that would survive droughts of power and continue to speak across the ages. That endurance is the Middle Kingdom's most remarkable achievement, a cultural flourishing born of reunification and sustained by the everyday labors of a people who believed in making order from chaos. When we speak of the New Kingdom of ancient Egypt, we speak of the height of Egyptian power, a span of fire and stone that stretched roughly from the 16th to the 11th century BCE. It was an age when pharaohs cast their dominion like long shadows over the Near East and Nubia, when art swelled into unparalleled grandeur, and when temples rose as cities of devotion and statecraft. To understand this period is to stand at the edge of a civilization that had learned how to project its will across deserts and rivers and to fashion an empire from trade, religion, and war. The story begins with the end of foreign domination and the rebirth of Egyptian kingship in a new, martial guise. Out of the chaotic twilight of the Second Intermediate Period emerged the liberator, Ahmose, a prince whose campaigns drove the Hyksos from the Nile Delta and reunited the land under native rule. His triumph was not merely military, it reasserted the pharaoh's role as both a warrior and a divine steward. Ahmose and his immediate successors reorganized the state, rebuilt shattered monuments, and initiated ambitious projects that signaled a confidence in the future. Their consolidation of power set the stage for an era where kings would no longer merely rule Egypt, but command an empire. From the Fourth Dynasty onward, royal ideology had emphasized continuity, but the New Kingdom added a new note, an outward thrust. Egypt began to send armies into Syria and Palestine, to negotiate with Hittites and Babylonians, and to establish client states whose rulers paid tribute. Control of resources, copper from Sinai, gold from Nubia, and timber from Lebanon, became a strategic imperative, and Egypt's borders were now lines on a map that signified both wealth and vulnerability. This outward expansion transformed the pharaoh from the keeper of flood and harvest into the commander of a diplomatic and military network. What distinguished the New Kingdom was not only conquest but the way kings converted victory into lasting monuments. Temples that had once been modest shrines became massive centers of state power. The great precinct of Ammonius-Ra at Karnak grew into a walled city of sanctuary and treasury, with pylons that announced the pharaoh's triumph and hypostyle halls whose columns soared like a forest petrified in stone. Such buildings served as places of worship but also as institutions of governance, economic hubs that collected taxes, stored grain, and coordinated labor on an imperial scale. The rise of the priesthood of Ammonius paralleled the growth of temple architecture, and by mid-New Kingdom the god Ammonius had become closely identified with the monarchy itself. Pharaohs endorsed this fusion, granting lands and privileges to temples and ensuring that priests would support royal ideology. Yet this intimacy between crown and cult would eventually create tensions, for a wealthy and autonomous clergy could, in times of weak kingship, become a counterweight to pharaonic authority. Through such tensions we can trace the ebb and flow of central power in the centuries to come. The reign of Hatshepsut is one of the clearest windows into the complexity of New Kingdom kingship. She began as regent for a juvenile successor and grew into a sovereign who wore the full regalia of a pharaoh, depicted with false beard and royal kilt, and celebrated with monumental building projects. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari is a remarkable feat of architectural harmony, terraces carved into cliff face, balustrades echoing the Nile's measured rhythm, and reliefs that narrate a famous expedition to punt for incense and exotic goods. Hatshepsut crafted an image of serene, prosperous rule that challenged expectations and showed how flexible Egyptian political ideology could be when it served the state. Behind Hatshepsut's peaceful commercial achievements stands the broader reality of New Kingdom logistics and trade. The ships that plied the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, the caravans that crossed desert tracks, and the sailors and craftsmen who carved the luxury goods were part of an economic system that fed the monuments. Foreign materials, cedar wood from Lebanon, ebony and gold from Punt, lapis lazuli from distant lands, were transformed by Egyptian hands into objects of ritual and display. This exchange was not purely material. It brought ideas, iconography, and diplomacy into an ever more connected ancient world. If Hatshepsut epitomized the cult of peaceful prosperity, Thutmose III epitomized the warrior pharaoh. Often called the Napoleon of Egypt, he conducted more than a dozen campaigns into Syria and Palestine, establishing Egypt as the dominant power in the Levant. His victory at Megiddo is recorded with a precision that reads like an ancient dispatch, a combination of daring maneuver and disciplined chariotry that secured tributary states and fortified Egyptian hegemony. Yet even Thutmose's wars were pieces of a larger civilizational pattern. Conquest-financed monuments affirmed divine kingship, and kingship organized the state's resources for more conquest. We must linger on the practical elements of ancient warfare to understand how empire was made. The New Kingdom is the age of the composite bow and the horse-drawn chariot, instruments that redefined mobility and ranged combat. Armies were organized into divisions, supported by logistics of supply and specialized troops like Nubian archers or mercenary contingents. But warfare in this era was also theatrical, victory stele, triumphal reliefs, and ritualized presentations of prisoners conveyed an image of order restored by the pharaoh, a narrative that justified further campaigns and the extraction of tribute. The administration that supported such power was both sophisticated and deeply anchored in Egyptian tradition. Viziers and regional governors, or nomarchs, managed the day-to-day functions of state, while a network of scribes kept records, calculated rations, and relayed commands. In Nubia, a viceroy of Kush governed on behalf of the pharaoh, collecting gold and supervising mining operations that fed the royal treasuries. This bureaucracy was fueled by literacy and record-keeping. It was both the brain and the spine of an empire that needed to move troops, materials, and messages across great distances. Artistic production flourished in the New Kingdom, but it did not merely reproduce old forms. It experimented in scale, narrative, and naturalism. Colossal statues and finely carved reliefs coexisted with intimate, exquisitely painted tombs. Artists became experts in creating illusions of depth and movement, and tomb decoration evolved into a sophisticated visual theology that guided the deceased into the afterlife. The palette of Egyptian art, deep blues, rich reds, bright yellows, served a language of symbolism as potent as hieroglyphs, a grammar by which the living could speak with gods and the dead could find their way to eternity. Nowhere is this artistic ambition clearer than in the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, a necropolis carved into the western cliffs as though to keep the dead close to the setting sun. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom abandoned the visible pyramids of old for hidden tombs cut into rock, chambers lined with painted scenes of gods, spells, and journeys through the netherworld. These tombs were workshops of meaning, their corridors designed to protect and sanctify, their walls offering spells from the Book of the Dead and other funerary manuals that explained how to pass judgments and navigate the afterlife's complex geography. The very architecture of these tombs became a map for divine transformation. The priests and mortuary cults that tended these tombs wielded substantial influence because the rituals they performed ensured the eternal well-being of the king, whose welfare was believed to be inseparable from the land's prosperity. Offerings of food, libations, and costly objects kept the pharaoh's ka, the life force, alive in perpetuity. This practice turned tombs and temples into long-term economic obligations, endowing cults with land, labor, and privilege, and causing temples to function as banks, granaries, and manufacturing centers. Such an intertwining of religion and economy is central to understanding how the New Kingdom sustained its splendor and how it eventually strained under the weight of its own institutions. Amenhotep III presided over a peak of royal opulence in the 14th century BCE, a time when diplomacy was conducted through letters that read like the private correspondence of kings. His reign witnessed marriage alliances with foreign houses, the exchange of gifts so lavish that gifts themselves became a form of political currency, and building projects unmatched in scale. The colossi of Memnon, the majestic statues flanking his mortuary temple, looked out over the Nile and proclaimed a message of permanence. Yet Amenhotep's gilded reign presaged an upheaval that would briefly reconfigure religious life and royal imagery. Akhenaten, born Amenhotep IV, stands among the most controversial and enigmatic figures of the New Kingdom. He reoriented Egyptian worship toward a singular focus on the Aten, the sun disk, and relocated the center of religion to a newly built city called Akhetaten, modern Amarna. His art broke with conventions. Representations of the royal family were intimate, at times startlingly naturalistic, and iconography emphasized a direct, quasi-monotheistic relationship between pharaoh and deity. Whether Akhenaten's reforms were theological, political, or personal, they unsettled the foundations of Egyptian ritual life and set the stage for restorationist forces to reassert themselves. The Amarna period is a brief, luminous chapter that throws into relief Egyptian flexibility and the limits of its institutions. The royal couple Akhenaten and Nefertiti presided over a court where new artistic expressions flourished and where the old elite found their prerogatives challenged. The famous Amarna letters, clay tablets written in Akkadian, revealed diplomatic negotiations with Hittites, Babylonians, and Canaanite city-states, showing that Egypt remained enmeshed in a complex international system even as it experimented with religious doctrine. When Akhenaten died, the old gods and their priests recovered their authority with a swiftness that speaks to the resilience of Egypt's traditional structures. Tutankhamun, the boy king who followed the Amarna interlude, came to symbolize the restoration of old order. His reign saw the hurried return of temples and cults to their former prominence, the reinstatement of Ammoni's preeminence, and the rewriting of royal names to distance the throne from Atenism. Tutankhamun's own tomb would be discovered millennia later in a remarkably intact state, and the treasures within would capture the modern imagination with a power their creators could never have foreseen. The riches found in his burial chamber tell us less about his political might and more about the funerary culture and craftsmanship that were sustained even in a fractious age. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 by Howard Carter reopened the world to ancient Egypt in a way that few events have matched. The unopened chambers, the gleam of gold masks, and the intimacy of personal objects gave the public a direct emotional connection with a dead monarch. That discovery reshaped modern perceptions of the New Kingdom, casting it in shimmering terms of treasure and mystery, while also catalyzing a new era of archaeology built on scientific rigor and, sometimes, colonial complications. The excavation process itself became part of the long story of how we come to know the ancient past. Beyond sensational finds, generations of archaeologists have pieced together the daily realities of New Kingdom life through settlements like Deir el-Medina, a village for the artisans who carved and decorated the royal tombs. Its streets were lined with modest houses, communal ovens, and the graffiti of ordinary people, revealing a world of craftsmen, families, disputes, and pious devotion. Ostraca and letters provide voices from the past, complaints about delayed rations, notes of affection, records of births and deaths, all counterpoints to the official narratives glorifying pharaohs and gods. Deir el-Medina reminds us that the monuments rested on the sweat and skill of communities whose lives were anything but eternalized. The artistry emerging from these workshops was astonishingly varied. Palette knives and finesse turned wood and stone into the likenesses of gods, while metalworkers pushed the limits of alloy and inlay to produce jewelry that survives as testimony to ancient technical mastery. Lapis lazuli, gold leaf, and finely wrought silver adorned coffins and amulets, each object charged with symbolic power. As craftsmen refined their trades, their products became both ritual necessities and vehicles of personal expression that traveled across borders with merchants and emissaries. Temples during the New Kingdom were not static reliquaries, they were living theaters of ritual drama, where priests invoked gods through daily rites and where festivals animated the city. The Opet Festival, the procession of Ammonius from Karnak to Luxor, combined politics and theology in a display of rejuvenation and royal renewal. During such spectacles, the pharaoh's image was paraded before the people, the divine presence was reaffirmed, and the rhythm of the agricultural year was synchronized with the authority of the state. These ceremonies fused public spectacle with theological certainty, binding populace and papacy to the figure of the king. Architecturally, New Kingdom temples achieved a monumental coherence that married symbolism with sophisticated engineering. Pylons, vast gatehouses with sloping walls, offered a dramatic approach to sanctuaries, while causeways and processional avenues controlled the movement of people and idol. Roofs were supported by columns modeled after reeds and lotus blossoms, so that walking into a hypostyle hall felt like moving under a petrified marshland of stone. The precision with which architects oriented sanctuaries toward celestial phenomena or riverine axes shows a culture concerned with aligning the terrestrial with the cosmic. Obelisks, those tapered, sky-piercing monoliths, spoke of kingship's ambition to bridge earth and heavens. When a pharaoh raised an obelisk, he erected a vertical manifesto of victory, often inscribed with dedications to gods and triumphs. The granite of Aswan became a quarry of symbolic language, each obelisk a message intended to last for eternity, to be read by gods and men. Their silhouette punctuated temple courtyards and processional ways, reminders that a king's deeds reached upward and outward. The economy that allowed such monumental building was complex and adaptable. Agricultural surpluses, harvested under careful management of the Nile's inundation, fed laborers who worked seasonally on state projects. The state organized corvée labor, a system that mobilized peasants for monumental work in exchange for maintenance and provisions. Yet this system demanded stability. Periodic failures of the Nile or disruptions in trade could strain the economy and create social pressures that reverberated through the polity. The New Kingdom's wealth was thus both abundant and precarious, a brilliance sustained by careful administration and the perennial mercy of the river. Egypt's diplomacy was as intricate as its economy, and the Amarna letters provide a rare glimpse into an ancient system of international relations. Kings corresponding with pharaohs discussed marriages, shared gifts, and negotiated alliances while complaining about delayed shipments or the unreliability of vassal rulers. These texts reveal that New Kingdom Egypt was simultaneously a hegemonic power and part of a system of mutual recognition among great houses. The tone of the letters ranges from formal politeness to sharp rebuke, and they display a world where image and reciprocity determined the flow of favors and obligations. The Battle of Kadesh stands as a turning point in military and diplomatic history and as a study in propaganda. Ramses II, a pharaoh who would become famed for his longevity and self-promotion, staged a grand campaign against the Hittite Empire that culminated at Kadesh on the Orontes. The reliefs and inscriptions commissioned by Ramses present the battle as a dramatic triumph, replete with divine intervention. Yet the resulting stalemate led shortly thereafter to a treaty that ranks among the earliest known peace agreements. The treaty itself, preserved in both Egyptian and Hittite versions, is an artifact of pragmatic diplomacy, an acknowledgement of limits, and a desire to stabilize a contested frontier. Ramses II's reign was an exercise in monumentalism and self-fashioning. He was a prolific builder whose works included temples, statues, and an expansion of existing sanctuaries, and he made his mark on the landscape as a public relations project writ in stone. Abu Simbel, those twin rock temples carved into the Nubian cliffs, were composed on a scale meant to impress both subject and foreigner alike, creating an image of pharaonic might that would persist for millennia. Ramses' long rule also institutionalized the royal cult to an extent, binding subjects' loyalties to the visible traces of a single monarch's legacy. But for all the grandeur of building, the later New Kingdom faced increasing pressures that eroded central authority. Economic strains, the rising power of priesthoods, and the logistical demands of empire put stress on state resources. Foreign incursions by sea peoples and Libyan groups tested the military fabric of the realm, and while resilient leaders like Ramesses III could repel invasions, the constant strain of defense and reconstruction was wearing. The accumulation of such stressors did not produce collapse in a single cataclysmic event, but rather a protracted decline of central institutions. Ramesses III's reign is often read as a terminal moment for the fortress of the New Kingdom. He faced invasions recorded as the campaigns of the Sea Peoples and fought hard to protect Egypt's frontiers and coasts. The mortuary temple of Medinet Habu recounts these struggles in vivid, terrifying reliefs of ship battles and captives, a visual rhetoric of defense and deliverance. Yet even his successes came with a price. The state's coffers, armies, and manpower were drained, and local powers began to assert autonomy in ways that the centralized pharaoh could not always control. One of the enduring mysteries of this period is the role of climate and environmental stress. Evidence of lower Nile floods, shifts in rainfall, and possible regional droughts appear in proxy records and hint at agricultural shortfalls that would have undermined tributary flows and tax revenues. A shrinking of grain surpluses would have immediate consequences for temple income, soldier payments, and public works, potentially fueling internal unrest. While climate alone does not explain political transformations, it acts as a crucial background factor that interacts with economic and social dynamics. The late New Kingdom also saw an increase in tomb robbery and internal criminality, symptoms of a society where the sanctity of burial could no longer be guaranteed by the state. Official tomb robbery papyri reveal an administrative system trying to police theft even as looters found ways to penetrate royal caches. The desecration of graves was not merely a matter of property. It struck at Egypt's most cherished beliefs about the afterlife and highlighted the fragility of institutions that could no longer fully protect the dead. As monuments began to be stripped or repurposed, the material evidence of decline became visible on the landscape. As central authority frayed, new regional actors emerged and older elites carved out greater autonomy. Libyan leaders found their way into Egypt's power structures, often starting as mercenaries but eventually establishing dynasties that would rule in the Third Intermediate Period. Nubian kingdoms also gained strength in the south, and local rulers in the Levant navigated shifting allegiances with a nimbleness that reflected the empire's attenuating grip. The dissolution of unified power produced a patchwork of competing centers, an outcome as much political as demographic and economic. Still, even amid decline, the cultural achievements of the New Kingdom continued to resonate. The canon of religious and artistic forms that had been refined in those centuries persisted into later ages, influencing Greek and Roman perceptions of Egypt. The Greeks and Romans admired Egyptian antiquity, attributing to it wisdom and an aura of mystery, and many of their own architects and artists borrowed from Egyptian motifs. Thus, the New Kingdom's visual and religious language traveled beyond its political lifespan to become part of a shared Mediterranean heritage. Women in the New Kingdom could wield extraordinary influence, whether as royal consorts, regents, or power brokers. The figure of Nefertiti, wife of Akhenaten, is famous for her iconic portraits and possible political agency during the Amarna period, standing as a partner in a religious revolution. Hatshepsut's unprecedented assumption of kingship shows that royal women could legitimize authority through ritual, construction, and representation. Royal women often held titles like Great Royal Wife and God's Wife of Ammonius, positions that gave them both ceremonial status and economic power, making them central figures in the unfolding narrative of the state. Religion in the New Kingdom was both conservator and innovator. It conserved ancient rites while absorbing new strands of belief, creating a rich theology of gods and divine kingship. Ritual practice was complex and highly codified, filled with recitations, offerings, and symbolic acts intended to sustain cosmic balance, known as ma'at. The pharaoh's role as mediator between gods and people framed public life, but everyday piety flourished outside the palace, where households maintained shrines and local deities received offerings. This multiplicity of devotional practices kept religion vibrant and adaptive even when political tides turned. When we read New Kingdom inscriptions, we must remember that they were both records and persuasion. Annals of victories, lists of gifts, and dedication texts shaped a narrative of pharaonic holiness and success designed to be read by gods and posterity. Historians must thus parse these sources carefully, reading for the grain of truth embedded in a medium often bent toward glorification. Yet even propaganda reveals a culture's priorities: the investment in posterity, divine legitimacy, and the visual reinforcement of authority. The New Kingdom's approach to death and the afterlife deepened the Egyptian project of permanence. Funerary texts multiplied and diversified, spells were compiled, tomb paintings told mythic dramas, and coffins were inscribed with guidance for the soul. Mummification techniques were refined to preserve bodies for eternity, while funerary goods were chosen not just for their wealth but for the symbolic functions they performed in the netherworld. Death thus became an arena in which the living negotiated continuity, using ritual knowledge and material splendor to secure an eternal future. Trade networks extended Egypt's reach far beyond its frontiers, with merchant ships crossing the Red Sea and the eastern Mediterranean to exchange not only goods but technologies and cultural practices. The expeditions to Punt, narrated in Hatshepsut's temple reliefs, suggest sea voyages that harvested exotic products and established long-term relationships. These ventures combined naval skill, navigational knowledge, and diplomatic finesse, and they reveal a world where the Nile was part of a larger maritime web connecting Africa, Arabia, and the Mediterranean. The craft of stoneworking underwent remarkable innovations, especially in the quarrying and transport of massive blocks that would become obelisks, statues, and temple facades. Workers knew how to split granite with bronze tools, wooden wedges, and lever systems, and they devised log rolling and sled techniques to move stones across sand. Such techniques required coordinated labor, precise planning, and an infrastructural capacity to feed and house the workforce. These technical achievements testify to the organizational sophistication that underpinned Egypt's monumental culture. Language and writing were instruments of power in the New Kingdom, and hieroglyphs adorned temples and tombs with a permanence that ink could not achieve. Scribes, trained in the fine arts of cursive hieratic and demotic shorthand, kept bureaucratic records that allowed the state to function. Textuality extended beyond administration to literature. Wisdom texts, hymns, and instructional compositions circulated, teaching proper conduct, piety, and the ideals of kingship. Through writing, the past was made to speak back into the present, shaping identity and memory. Relief carving during the New Kingdom reached new levels of narrative clarity. Battle scenes, ritual sequences, and royal processions were rendered in shallow relief that caught light and shadow, animating the stone. These images were not static decorations, but parts of a storytelling system that guided viewers through history, myth, and theology. Carvers used perspective and scale to communicate social hierarchies, with the pharaoh presented larger than life, the gods rendered with symbolic attributes, and enemies shown diminished, their gestures frozen in defeat. The visual vocabulary of reliefs instructed and impressed, merging aesthetics with power. The household economy also played a vital role in sustaining larger structures. Family farms, artisanal workshops, and domestic industries produced goods consumed locally and exported abroad, while markets in towns and provincial centers allowed for social exchange and the circulation of information. Women managed households, engaged in weaving and pottery production, and participated in religious life, shaping the rhythm of daily existence. Domestic artifacts, from pottery to personal jewelry, illuminate a lived culture that balanced ritual steel with the simple pragmatics of grain storage and child rearing. Music, dance, and performance were integral to religious and social life, animating temple ceremonies and domestic celebrations alike. Harps, lutes, and percussion instruments accompanied chants and recitations, while dancers performed for public festivals and private banquets. Musicians held a respected place in court and temple, and their presence in funerary scenes suggests that music was thought to accompany the soul on its journey. These performative arts were not mere entertainment, they were part of the sacred apparatus by which community and cosmos were harmonized. Relief inscriptions and monumental art also reveal the cosmopolitan nature of the New Kingdom, a civilization that absorbed foreigners as workers, soldiers, and even members of the court. Nubians, Libyans, Syrians, and Canaanites appear in excavated records, sometimes as captives and sometimes as integrated members of society, contributing skills and cultural influences. This movement of peoples made Egypt a crossroads of exchange and created a population whose diversity was woven into the fabric of imperial administration and local communities. The role of the vizier as the pharaoh's chief minister exemplifies the hierarchical complexity of the New Kingdom. Certainly, the vizier adjudicated disputes, oversaw state workshops, and coordinated large-scale projects, but he was also a symbolic stand-in for the king's omniscience. His appointment required loyalty and competence, for a corrupt or weak vizier could unravel the finely balanced systems of taxation and labor. The office demonstrates the necessity of delegate authority within a centralized monarchy and the fragile chain by which royal commands reached the provinces. Education was shaped around scribal training, which produced the literate elite who could read temple inscriptions and manage state accounts. The curriculum of scribal schools emphasized copying texts, memorizing lists, and mastering a stylized form of writing that allowed for precision in record keeping. Literacy remained limited to a small stratum of elites, but even this subset was crucial. Clerks, priests, and administrators were the gears through which state policy became reality. Those who could write could make history and govern it. Religious iconography evolved in the New Kingdom to include complex combinations of gods, syncretism, and local variations. Ammonius might be fused with Ra to create Ammonius Ra, or a local lion goddess might be integrated into a larger pantheon. This theological flexibility allowed the state to absorb and assimilate regional cults, creating a unified religious language that still permitted local expression. Such syncretism is evidence of an adaptive religious imagination that kept the structure of belief robust across centuries and across the many lands under Egyptian influence. The relationship between Egypt and Nubia deserves special attention because the southern regions supplied gold and manpower vital to the empire's survival. Nubian archers formed elite units in the Egyptian army, and gold mines in Nubia enriched the royal treasuries. Egyptian authorities established administrative centers and garrison towns in Nubia, fostering a colonial imprint that mixed economic extraction with cultural exchange. Yet Nubia also preserved its distinct identity and at times asserted independence, reminding us that imperial incorporation was never total assimilation. Certain pharaohs of the New Kingdom became legends in their own centuries: Hatshepsut for her peaceful prosperity, Thutmose III for his military brilliance, Amenhotep III for his lavish diplomacy, Akhenaten for his religious experiment, Ramses II for his monumental legacy. Each king curated an image through monuments, inscriptions, and public works, understanding that posterity would read their reign as a narrative. Their reputations were thus crafted with great care, performed in stone and story, and their legacies were continually reshaped by successors who chose to honor, modify, or erase their predecessors. The matter of erasure and restoration is a fascinating thread through New Kingdom history. Hatshepsut's images were defaced and her name often chiseled away after her death, a posthumous attempt to minimize her precedent. Similarly, Akhenaten's monuments were systematically dismantled and his images attacked in a campaign of iconoclasm designed to restore the old gods. But such erasures are themselves historical testimony, tracing the conflicts and reconciliations of memory politics in ancient Egypt. Restoration, like destruction, reveals who held power in the wake of ritual and political crises. While kings commanded armies and built temples, craftspeople and artisans invented and refined techniques that would ensure the durability of the age's art. Metalworkers perfected gilding and inlay, potters produced vessels for everyday and ritual use, and textile workers wove linen fine enough to dress the images of the gods. These techniques were not static traditions but evolving crafts, adapted to new demands and tastes, handed down in workshops and guilds whose members kept the artistic flame alive. The survival of their products through thousands of years is a testament to their skill and cultural continuity. Religion and kingship intersected in the very concept of divine birth that some pharaohs promoted to legitimize rule. Scenes of royal birth often depict the god Ammonius impregnating a queen, thereby making the child both divine and royal by narrative right. Such artistic and textual fictions fulfilled a political function, smoothing succession and underscoring the pharaoh's unique status as an intermediary between humans and gods. These rituals of legitimacy were part of a larger symbolic system that maintained hierarchical order and civic cohesion. Economic records, like tax rosters and grain inventories, show that the state was meticulous about resources, collecting tribute and allocating rations carefully to sustain large-scale projects. Scribes tallied everything from cattle to workers' bread portions, and granaries kept detailed accounts that ensured the state could mobilize labor when needed. This meticulous record-keeping was an administrative backbone that enabled the pharaoh to command both the peasant workforce and the artisan corps. Without such organization, the grand monuments of the New Kingdom would have remained impossible dreams. The diversity of funerary texts speaks to the richness of Egyptian eschatology. Books like the Book of Gates or the Book of Caverns offered different itineraries through the underworld, each with its symbolic dangers and salvations. Pharaohs and nobles chose spells and images that fit personal or political needs, creating tombs as curated experiences for the departed soul. This literary pluralism suggests that even within a stable ritual tradition there was room for personalization, innovation, and theological play. The interplay between official cults and popular religion gave Egyptian spirituality both depth and breadth. While temple cults conducted the grand rituals, household devotions and magical practices offered immediate solutions to everyday woes. Amulets, spells, and private votive offerings addressed fertility, health, and protection, crafting a lived religion that was pragmatic and intimate. The coexistence of formal and informal piety demonstrates the adaptability of religious systems in addressing both cosmic order and human anxieties. Archaeology has reshaped our understanding of New Kingdom daily life by revealing material contexts that texts cannot fully describe. Pottery styles help date occupations and indicate trade patterns, while refused pits show food consumption and culinary habits. Archaeobotanical remains tell us what people ate: barley, emmer wheat, onions, and dates, and faunal analysis reveals the meat and fish of daily diets. These tangible remnants lend flesh to the general outlines of history, grounding grand narratives in the mundane textures of life. The transmission of New Kingdom culture into later ages was neither linear nor uniform, but it was persistent. Roman travelers marveled at Egyptian obelisks and temples, Christian monks reused pagan structures as retreats, and Islamic builders incorporated pharaonic stone into new constructions. The persistence of these monuments across religious transformations testifies to their durable aesthetic and engineering value. Even when meanings shifted, the presence of stone sanctuaries continued to anchor the landscape in memory and utility. The process of deciphering hieroglyphs unlocked a deeper, more human voice from the inscriptions of the New Kingdom. Jean-François Champollion's breakthrough in the early 19th century allowed scholars to read inscriptions and learn how ancient Egyptians spoke about themselves. Decipherment transformed inscriptions from mute stones into lively texts that disclosed legal disputes, love poetry, and royal propaganda. This intellectual revolution broadened our capacity to understand the New Kingdom on its own terms, rather than solely through external accounts. Tourism and modern preservation efforts have reshaped the way the New Kingdom is engaged with today. Large numbers of visitors walk the hypostyle halls, stand before the colossal seated Ammonius Ra, and descend into tombs that were once the private domain of kings. Managing this heritage requires balancing accessibility with conservation, as ancient pigments and fragile wall paintings are threatened by humidity and human breath. The modern encounter with the New Kingdom is thus a negotiation between public fascination and scientific stewardship. The New Kingdom left behind a rich corpus of legal documents that reveal the contours of justice and dispute resolution. Cases of theft, land disputes, and contract disagreements were litigated before local officials and sometimes elevated to royal courts. Law was administered in terms that combined precedent, custom, and the moral language of Ma'at, so that justice served cosmic as well as social order. Legal records thus illuminate how communities negotiated fairness and how the state intervened to maintain social equilibrium. In studying the New Kingdom, we must also attend to its languages of power, dress, regalia, and visual codes that signaled rank and role. The Nemes headdress, the double crown, and the Ankh sign were part of a communicative repertoire that identified and sacralized authority. Clothing, jewelry, and posture were visual shorthand for social position, and the court used such symbols to instruct the populace about hierarchy. In this way, material culture became a lexicon of governance. The funerary economy supported entire industries, turning death into a field of specialization. Embalmers developed complex recipes for treating bodies, working in specialized workshops that mixed chemistry and ritual. Coffin makers, mask painters, and amulet producers formed guilds that catered to different social classes, offering varying degrees of elaboration according to means. This funerary market demonstrates how belief and commerce interlocked, with artisans producing objects that were both devotional and economic commodities. A striking aspect of New Kingdom administration was its ability to integrate conquered peoples into the state apparatus through strategies of patronage and incorporation. Vassal kings in the Levant were bound by treaties and marriages to Egypt, yet they retained a measure of autonomy that made empire manageable without total absorption. This balance of autonomy and obligation was a pragmatic model of imperial rule, one that allowed Egypt to project influence without overextending direct control. It also made diplomacy an essential complement to warfare. Ritual specialists and oracular practices offered the pharaoh guidance on decisions both public and private. Priest astrologers read omens, temple seers interpreted dreams, and oracular pronouncements could settle contested policy choices. Such practices were not mere superstition but institutionalized procedures embedded in the governance of the state, providing a framework through which decisions gained divine sanction. In effect, religion was a form of administrative technology for decision-making. Legends and popular storytelling preserved the reputations of New Kingdom heroes and villains long after political realities changed. Tales of cunning officials, virtuous scribes, and righteous kings circulated in the form of stories that taught moral lessons and celebrated cultural ideals. These narratives were moral tools, producing exemplars for behavior and for royal qualities that communities found admirable. Thus, the New Kingdom's legacy lived on in the moral imagination of later generations. Technological innovations were not limited to monumental art but also included improvements in agricultural implements, irrigation techniques, and animal domestication that supported population growth and urbanization. Plows and sickles evolved, water channels were maintained with administrative oversight, and livestock management contributed to both diet and economy. Such improvements had cumulative effects over generations, enabling denser settlements and more reliable surplus production that the state could mobilize for projects or military needs. The material culture of luxury in the New Kingdom, golden masks, inlaid chariots, and enameled jewelry, carried symbolic weight beyond mere opulence. Gold, for example, represented not only wealth but divine durability, a metal associated with the flesh of gods and the eternity of celestial bodies. To be buried with gold was to be wrapped in a material that claimed the aura of the divine, reiterating the pharaoh's role as a semi-divine figure. Thus, luxury goods served theological as well as aesthetic functions. The study of human remains from New Kingdom cemeteries reveals patterns of health, diet, and disease that temper idealized visions of the past. Skeletal analyses show that while elites enjoyed varied diets and relatively better living conditions, commoners bore the physical marks of labor, nutritional stress, and disease. Patterns of trauma and arthritis tell of heavy workloads and occupational hazards, reminding us that the beauty of monuments coexisted with human wear. Bioarchaeology thus humanizes grand narratives, giving voice to the bodies that built and sustained the civilization. Linguistic nuances in royal titulary conveyed theological assertions about kingship, each pharaoh bearing a series of names that announced divine patronage, mortal identity, and regal role. The throne name proclaimed the cosmic purpose of a king, while the personal name linked him to human lineage. Inscriptions worked together to produce a complete royal persona. These names were not trivial. To change a royal name could signal a theological pivot or a political recalibration. In this way, language structured the very identity of sovereignty. The New Kingdom's amphitheater of festivals and pageantry extended into the provinces, where local rituals echoed the state's major ceremonies but retained distinctive regional flavors. Provincial temples celebrated local manifestations of gods, and regional elites used these moments to display loyalty to the central power while also asserting local prestige. Festivals functioned as social glue, occasions where obligations were renewed, networks reinforced, and the fabric of communal life was made visible. In moments of ritual, the empire's diversity found a cooperative choreography. The archaeology of the workman's village at Deir el-Medina reveals the rhythms of an artisan life organized around sacred production and marked by recurring tensions over pay and provision. Strikes recorded in the papyri show that even monarchic economies had mechanisms for grievances. When rations were delayed, workers sometimes halted their tasks, forcing temple authorities to negotiate. These episodes remind us that labor was not merely compelled but had embedded expectations and bargaining practices rooted in communal norms. Work itself became a site of social contract. The treatment of captured enemies in iconography and ritual underscores the New Kingdom's rhetorical strategies for defining order. Captives were often depicted bound and dehumanized, symbols of chaos subdued by pharaonic will, reinforcing the narrative of cosmic restoration. Such imagery served to terrify opponents and reassure subjects, turning military success into theological proof of the pharaoh's efficacy. The spectacle of victory had as much psychological function as political utility. Mentions of medicine and healing in papyri and temple inscriptions show a blend of practical and magical therapies. Physicians employed surgical techniques, herbal prescriptions, and incantations in a medical culture that combined observation with ritual. Temples often served as centers of healing, where priests performed both religious and therapeutic roles, and this intersection demonstrates how science and spirituality were fused in the service of public health. Medical practice in the New Kingdom was thus a cultural hybrid, pragmatic in its aims and ritualized in its execution. The New Kingdom's romance with monumental stone left an environmental imprint that modern scholars still measure. Quarrying altered landscapes, the transport of heavy stones consumed resources, and the maintenance of vast temple complexes required sustained labor and materials. These environmental costs, while often overlooked, were part of the calculus of empire. Splendor demanded resources and had ecological consequences that rippled across time. The ancient builders counted permanence in stone. Modern observers count traces of those labors in the archaeology of landscapes. The New Kingdom produced literary masterpieces that provide compelling windows into ethics and ideology, including tales of wise men and courtly satire that instruct on proper conduct and moral discernment. Works like the story of Sinew reveal personal anxieties about exile, identity, and homecoming, offering emotional resonance that feels surprisingly modern. Such narratives cultivate an introspective strand in Egyptian culture, one that complements the public monuments with private meditations on exile, loyalty, and human longing. In the final centuries of the New Kingdom, regional governors and military commanders became increasingly important power brokers, sometimes eclipsing the authority of the pharaoh. Such local strongmen could mobilize troops, levy taxes, and control trade routes, making them indispensable to a weakening central administration. This diffusion of power presaged the fragmentation of the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean, where multiple centers of authority jostled for advantage in an increasingly fluid political landscape. The breakdown of monopoly on force was a crucial vector in the empire's dissolution. The artistic innovations of the Amarna period did not vanish with the restoration of orthodoxy. Instead, elements persisted. Naturalistic features, intimate family scenes, and certain stylistic freedoms were absorbed selectively into subsequent art. This selective retention speaks to the culture's ability to incorporate novelty while maintaining a coherent visual program. Innovation in the Egyptian tradition, even when contested, often became part of the longue durée. The New Kingdom's monumental inscriptions continue to teach us about ancient intentions, yet the gaps in the record remind us of the limits of survival. Many texts were chiseled away, many tombs looted, and many perishable objects have long since turned to dust. Archaeologists work with fragments, reconstructing probable holes through painstaking comparison and inference. The tantalizing incompleteness of the evidence invites creative historical imagination grounded in methodical scholarship. As the New Kingdom waned, it left a terrain of contested memory where kings were reevaluated and institutions reconfigured. The priesthoods that had grown powerful were recalibrated, foreign groups gained influence, and the once commanding reach of pharaonic authority was reduced to a patchwork of regional powers. The transition to the Third Intermediate Period was neither sudden nor neat, but it was a transformation that marked the end of an era of imperial coherence. This decline serves as a reminder that great powers ebb as well as flow. Yet even in decline, the New Kingdom's achievements endured, its temples continued to be rebuilt, its texts continued to be copied, and its aesthetic language continued to inspire. The echoes of those centuries passed into the cultural reservations of later Egypt and beyond, giving the ancient world a set of images and ideas about kingship, eternity, and art. The New Kingdom thus became not only a historical epic but a cultural template, one that subsequent ages would admire, adapt, and sometimes misread. The New Kingdom's legacy in modern imagination is complex, layered with the romance of discovery and the sober work of reconstruction. Tutankhamun's treasures sparked popular fascination, while scholarly excavation and philology opened windows into daily life and governance. The field of Egyptology matured through these discoveries, developing methods that emphasize preservation, context, and interdisciplinary inquiry. Our modern engagement with this ancient era is thus the product of both wonder and rigorous scholarship. To stand today in the shadow of Karnak or Abu Simbel is to feel the tangible force of a civilization that continually negotiated the relationship between the ephemeral human and the enduring divine. The rhythm of festivals, the labor of artisans, the diplomacy of distant courts, and the faith that shaped burial rites all interwove into an imperial tapestry of remarkable complexity. The New Kingdom's story is not a single trajectory of ascent and fall, but a collage of innovations, continuities, and transformations that shaped a world in which stone, sky, and river met in a powerful synthesis. Listening to the long arc of the New Kingdom, we encounter a civilization that balanced conquest and devotion, administration and artistry, faith and pragmatism. Pharaohs strove for immortality in stone, priests stewarded gods who guaranteed cosmic order, workers carved the visible record of triumphs and tragedies, and scribes kept the ledgers of an empire that linked the Nile to distant shores. The era's grandeur was no mere accident. It was the outcome of generations of craft, belief, and political invention. The New Kingdom invites us to think about the relationship between power and culture, and about how states transform resources into meaning. It compels us to consider how religious institutions can both buttress and challenge secular authority, and how artistic innovation can be both political expression and personal devotion. In the remains of temples, tombs, and papyri we find a civilization that worked to order both the world and the afterlife, constructing not only monuments but a worldview that would endure across millennia. As we draw this long exploration to continued reflection rather than finality, remember that the New Kingdom story is not a closed book but a living archive. Each excavation, each inscription read anew, and each scientific advance adds a fresh page, allowing us to hear the voices of kings and workers, priests and craftsmen, lovers and litigants. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom carved a world in stone and left it for us to read, to admire, and to interpret, inviting every new generation to imagine the rhythms of an ancient land where power and piety unfolded beneath the same sun. The final centuries of ancient Egyptian grandeur were not the end of a single moment but a long, slow folding of one world into another. The monuments that had once been built with an easy certainty of purpose now watched different banners fly above them, while new tongues were spoken in temples that had echoed only with ritual for 1,000 years. This is a story of decline that is also a story of adaptation, of resilience and reinvention, and of how a civilization's reputation outlived its independence. To understand how Egypt moved from pharaonic rule into foreign hands, it helps to imagine the Nile as both stage and actor. The river regulated crops and taxes, enabled transport and communication, and shaped the psychology of power. When the Nile faltered, through subtle shifts in climate, changes in agricultural productivity, or the frailties of centralized control, the social contract that supported the pharaoh could fray, inviting challengers from inside and outside. By the end of the New Kingdom, around 1070 BCE, the centralized authority that had so masterfully marshaled resources across the valley began to loosen. Provincial governors grew more powerful, and internal disputes over succession weakened the throne. These developments did not erase the culture overnight, but they created openings that neighboring peoples and rival dynasts could exploit. The Third Intermediate Period and the Late Period saw a patchwork of local dynasties, Libyan chieftains, and Nubian kings all claiming legitimacy in turn. Egypt became a place of overlapping claims and shifting capitals. Each ruler drew on ancient symbols to assert authority, yet the reality was that power had become more negotiable and more dependent on military backing and economic networks than it had been in the age of mighty pharaohs. Foreign pressures increased with time. The Near East was in motion. Assyrian and later Persian empires expanded, looking to control Egypt's wealth and strategic position. Egypt's own resources could appear both irresistible and costly, and the military needs to defend the delta and the eastern borders forced rulers to rely on mercenaries and foreign troops, which in turn diluted purely Egyptian command structures. Persian incursion marked a decisive shift. The Achaemenid Persians made two major incursions in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, ruling Egypt as a satrapy, a province within a larger imperial machine. They retained many administrative practices because Egyptian bureaucracy was sophisticated and useful, but Persian governors imposed foreign taxation and control, and the presence of foreign garrisons was a visible symbol of conquered autonomy. Under Persian rule, temple wealth was often appropriated to support an empire whose heart lay in distant lands. Yet temples continued to function as centers of local life. Priests still performed rituals, and the language of religious authority remained Egyptian, so on a daily level the culture showed remarkable continuity even while political sovereignty had been absorbed by an imperial system. Egyptian resistance did not vanish. Native rulers staged revivals and brief restorations, and rebellions flared when imperial attention faltered. These moments of comeback spoke both to a persistent sense of identity and to the relative ease with which control could sometimes ebb from an empire stretched across continents. Still, the pattern of foreign intervention had been set and would repeat with new faces and different claims. Into this landscape stepped a figure who would change the face of Egyptian history in an unmistakable way, Alexander of Macedon. His conquest in 332 BCE came quickly and with the theatrical certainty of a man who saw himself as an heir to several traditions. Alexander presented himself to Egyptians as a liberator from the Persians and as a pharaoh who would stand in the line of the great rulers of the past. Alexander's arrival initiated an era of Hellenistic rule that mixed Greek and Egyptian elements, creating a cosmopolitan blend that was new and complicated. The city of Alexandria, founded on the Fertile Delta, became the emblem of this hybrid age, a Greek polis built with Egyptian stones and the home of a multicultural population including Greeks, Jews, and native Egyptians. Its library and its intellectual milieu cast a long shadow over the Mediterranean world. When Alexander died, his generals carved his empire into pieces. Ptolemy, one of those generals, took Egypt and founded a dynasty that would last nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemies were Greek kings ruling a fundamentally Egyptian society, and they exaggerated both Greekness and Egyptian tradition in ways that suited their aims. They dressed as pharaohs in temple reliefs and spoke the language of Hellenistic kingship in council chambers. The Ptolemaic period was one of immense wealth and cultural cross-fertilization, but it was also a time of tension. Greek elites often monopolized high office and land, while native Egyptians were sometimes relegated to lower administrative and social positions. To manage this divided society, Ptolemaic rulers offered patronage to both Greek and Egyptian institutions, funding temples and sponsoring new cults while also supporting theaters, gymnasiums, and Hellenistic learning. Economically, Ptolemaic Egypt was a powerhouse. It exported grain throughout the Mediterranean, and the Ptolemies ran a highly organized state monopoly over key resources. At the same time, the state's thirst for revenue could be oppressive. Heavy taxation and compulsory labor demands left many ordinary people vulnerable, and those pressures contributed to social unrest and periodic revolts. Religion became a political tool as much as a spiritual anchor. The Ptolemies engaged in a careful game of religious syncretism, merging Greek and Egyptian gods into composite deities and establishing ruler cults that blended divine kingship with Hellenistic sovereignty. The cult of Serapis, a god created through deliberate fusion, is a vivid example of how faith and politics became entangled to sustain a dynasty's legitimacy. Despite such efforts, social stratification and intermittent crises weakened the dynasty over time. Internal quarrels for succession were frequent, and the Ptolemaic court became notorious for intrigue and fratricide. These internal fractures made Egypt more vulnerable to Roman influence, a tide that had been slowly sweeping across the region as the Roman Republic expanded eastward. By the 1st century BCE, Rome was the Mediterranean's dominant power, and Egypt's strategic value, its grain, its navy, its position linking lands, drew Rome's interest relentlessly. Ptolemaic rulers attempted alliances and maneuvers to preserve autonomy, but the scale and reach of Roman power made true independence difficult to maintain. The dynastic politics of the Ptolemies culminated in a famous relationship when Cleopatra VII, a monarch as politically shrewd as she was charismatic, entangled herself with Roman leaders in an attempt to restore Egyptian power. Cleopatra's alliances with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony represented both a bold gamble and a recognition of realpolitik. She sought Rome's support to protect her throne and to secure Egypt's position. Her eventual defeat, together with Antony, by Octavian signaled not just the end of a dynasty but the absorption of Egypt into the Roman imperial system. In 30 BCE, Egypt became a Roman province, a personal possession of the emperor that was administered with particular care. Rome forbade senators from visiting Egypt without imperial permission because it was seen as a jewel in the emperor's crown and a vital grain source. The Roman administration introduced new institutions and legal frameworks, but it also had to respect and co-opt existing Egyptian systems to maintain order and productivity. Under Rome, urban life in cities like Alexandria flourished in different ways. Alexandria remained a center of learning and commerce, and Roman patrons invested in public buildings and infrastructure. Yet Alexandria existed side by side with the countryside where the rhythms of Nile-fed agriculture continued much as they had for centuries, anchored by village life and traditional temple networks. Christianity arrived in Egypt in the 1st century CE and found fertile ground in its dense social networks and literate traditions. The Coptic Church developed from these early Christian communities, blending Egyptian language and monastic practices with the new faith. Monasticism, in particular, took root in Egyptian deserts and monasteries in ways that would influence Christianity across the Mediterranean and beyond. The spread of Christianity did not happen without friction. Pagan religious institutions, long integral to social and ritual life, declined under a complex mix of Christianization policies and changing social patterns. Temples fell out of state sponsorship and some were closed, but many sites continued to be used or were repurposed by local communities. The old gods faded in public prominence even as their symbols remained carved into stone and passed into folklore. Egypt's integration into the Byzantine Empire after the division of the Roman world brought further shifts. The Byzantine state was Christian and Greek-speaking, which reinforced the Hellenistic and Christian character of urban elites, but rural Egypt retained a distinctive Coptic identity. Tensions between the Chalcedonian theology of Constantinople and the Miaphysite beliefs of many Egyptian Christians contributed to social tensions and made Byzantine rule sometimes resented on religious grounds. These religious fissures weakened the bonds between Egypt and Constantinople at a time when new forces were emerging in the surrounding world. The 7th century witnessed a transformation that would permanently alter Egypt's cultural and linguistic landscape, the Arab-Islamic conquest. The arrival of Arab armies in 641 CE under the command of Amr ibn al-As ushered in a new chapter of rule that brought Islam and the Arabic language into deeper contact with Egyptian society. The Arab conquest was relatively swift, and it did not annihilate existing institutions immediately. Instead, it established a new political order that gradually Islamicized the elite and introduced Arabic as the language of administration. Over generations, Arabic spread through urban centers and among traders, while Egyptian language and customs adapted, mixed, and in many cases persisted beneath the surface of new public identities. Islamic governance reorganized land and tax systems, often continuing local administrative practices because they were efficient and familiar. New social hierarchies formed, with Arab and Muslim elites often occupying privileged positions. Conversion to Islam was a gradual process influenced by social incentives, economic pressures, the appeal of Islamic teachings, and the slow spread of new communal identities. Coptic Christians persisted as a significant community and maintained their traditions, contributing to Egyptian culture from within a new plural system. Coptic monasteries continued to be centers of learning and spiritual life, and Coptic art and liturgy preserved elements of Pharaonic and Hellenistic culture in ways that are striking to modern witnesses. The continuity of liturgical language and artistic motifs made Copts living bridges to Egypt's ancient past. Medieval Egypt became a vital part of the Islamic world, dominating trade routes and intellectual exchange. Under the Tulunids, Ikhshitids, and later the Fatimid Caliphate, Egypt thrived as a center of economic power and culture. The Fatimids established Cairo as a capital that would rival Alexandria in prestige, building institutions such as the Al-Azhar Mosque, which would become a lasting seat of learning. Cairo's rise did not eclipse the ancient sites along the Nile, but it drew the political focus away from some older religious centers. Trade and urban growth concentrated wealth in new forms, and Egypt's strategic position between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea made it central to commerce linking Europe, Africa, and Asia. This role continued to shape Egypt's fortunes throughout medieval times. The Crusades and intermittent invasions from the east and north tested Egypt's defenses, but it often emerged as a center of Islamic power, culminating in the Mamluk Sultanate. The Mamluks, originally slave soldiers who rose to rule, governed Egypt from the 13th to the 16th century and protected the region against Mongol incursions. Their rule revived Cairo as a magnificent capital, and they patronized architecture and the arts while maintaining a formidable military state. Despite Mamluk strength, new empires loomed. In 1517, the Ottoman Turks defeated the Mamluks and folded Egypt into the growing Ottoman Empire. Ottoman conquest placed Egypt under the suzerainty of a distant imperial center in Constantinople, yet the province retained local specificities. Ottoman governors, known as pashas, administered Egypt often through existing elites and local power structures, and the Mamluk elite adapted as landowners and military intermediaries. Ottoman rule introduced administrative and fiscal practices that integrated Egypt into a broader imperial economy. It was a period of relative continuity in everyday life for many Egyptians, even as international trade patterns and military technologies evolved. The Nile remained the heart of agricultural existence, while coastal trade and caravan routes linked Egypt to a fast-changing world. By the 18th and early 19th centuries, Egypt's strategic importance drew the attention of European powers. The weakening Ottoman center and the rising ambition of local rulers created opportunities. Muhammad Ali Pasha, an Albanian Ottoman officer who rose to become the Ottoman viceroy of Egypt in the early 19th century, embarked on dramatic modernization projects that aimed to transform Egypt into a powerful, quasi-independent state. Muhammad Ali's reforms were radical for his time. He created a modern army, developed industry, and restructured agriculture, often by enforcing state control over large swathes of land. He cultivated a centralized bureaucracy and sought to remake Egypt into a modern power capable of resisting Ottoman and European dominance. Yet his efforts also imported new strains, including conscription and heavy taxation, which put pressure on rural communities. At the same time, European interest did not wane. Napoleon Bonaparte's Egyptian expedition at the end of the 18th century had already sparked intense European fascination with Egyptian antiquities, language, and the idea of ancient Egypt. Napoleon's scholars documented the monuments, and the Rosetta Stone, discovered during that period, would provide the key to unlocking hieroglyphs nearly 2 decades later. European involvement deepened with the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, a transformative event that shortened maritime routes between Europe and Asia and placed Egypt at the center of global trade. The canal brought unprecedented international attention, investment, and debt. Egypt's financial dependence on European creditors mounted, and political control increasingly tipped toward foreign influence, particularly British and French interests. By the late 19th century, British power had grown decisive. In 1882, following nationalist unrest and concerns over foreign investments, Britain effectively occupied Egypt. The occupation lasted decades and was justified by strategic aims, protecting the Suez Canal and European economic interests, and by notions of civilization that Europeans used to rationalize imperial control. British rule brought administrative reforms, railways, and irrigation projects, but it also entrenched foreign dominance in Egyptian politics. Colonial policies generated resistance and nationalism. Egyptian intellectuals, professionals, and political groups sought independence, drawing on a mixture of modern political ideas and older cultural pride. Leaders like Saad Zaghloul and movements such as the Wafd Party mobilized mass support, and riots, strikes, and political negotiations slowly forced Britain to make concessions. Eventually, a formal, though limited, independence was recognized in 1922, but British influence persisted in security and economic spheres. Throughout the colonial and post-colonial periods, the legacy of ancient Egypt was both a source of pride and a political resource. Egyptian nationalists invoked the pharaonic past to craft a sense of continuity and unique identity distinct from the Ottoman, Arab, and European narratives. Monuments became symbols and slogans in schoolbooks, signaling a deep historical root that national leaders used to legitimate modern authority. At the same time, Western fascination with ancient Egypt had created a global market in artifacts and ideas. Museums across Europe and North America acquired Egyptian collections, while explorers and archaeologists competed for discoveries. This circulation of objects and knowledge popularized the image of Egypt, but also sparked controversies about the removal of antiquities and the ethics of archaeology that still resonate today. The 20th century saw significant archaeological progress. Deciphering hieroglyphs, systematic excavations, and advances in conservation revealed previously hidden chapters of Egyptian history. Finds like the intact tombs in the Valley of the Kings and the unearthing of entire burial complexes for royal families fueled public imagination and academic inquiry alike. These discoveries contributed to a modern script of ancient Egypt that combined glamour with rigorous scholarship. World War II and changing geopolitics accelerated decolonization globally, and Egypt was no exception. In 1952, a revolution led by the Free Officers, a group of nationalist military officers including Gamal Abdel Nasser, overthrew the monarchic system. Nasser's policies of land reform, nationalization, and anti-imperial rhetoric reshaped modern Egypt and claimed pharaonic symbolism among other historical references to craft a narrative of sovereignty and modernization. Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal in 1956 was both a political gamble and an assertion of post-colonial independence. The ensuing Suez Crisis revealed the waning of traditional European imperial power and the shifting balance of Cold War politics, with the United States and Soviet Union pressing for different outcomes. In the end, Egypt emerged with greater control over its territory and an enhanced sense of national pride. Modern Egypt continued to negotiate its ancient legacy in multiple realms: in education, where school curricula taught the long arc of Egyptian history; in tourism, where visitors flowed by the hundreds of thousands to see the pyramids and temples; and in culture, where artists and writers drew on ancient motifs to explore contemporary themes. The pharaonic past became a creative wellspring for a society that was itself changing rapidly under urbanization and globalization. Tourism became a significant industry, and with it came both economic opportunity and the risk of commodification. Monument conservation became a major concern as exposure to millions of visitors, environmental stresses, and pollution threatened fragile stone and painted surfaces. Preservation efforts required cooperation among international scholars, local authorities, and sometimes foreign governments, producing an intricate web of collaboration and occasional tension. The question of repatriation, returning artifacts taken during colonial eras back to Egypt, gained momentum in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. High-profile remains and objects in museums abroad spurred debates about cultural ownership, historical justice, and the responsibilities of institutions. These debates were not only legal or diplomatic, they were moral and symbolic, touching on how nations remember themselves and how former imperial powers reckon with the past. Egypt's own archaeological community grew more professional and assertive. Egyptian authorities developed a stronger role in excavations and in the management of their heritage, demanding collaboration on their terms. Local museums expanded and new ones were built to house treasures that had long left the country, while Egyptian scholars published research that shifted the centers of knowledge-making about the ancient past. The complexity of Egypt's modern identity includes the continuing influence of Islam and Arab culture, the legacies of Coptic Christianity, and the remembered weight of pharaonic antiquity. Cultural continuity is therefore not linear but layered, with each era leaving traces in language, law, art, and ritual. Modern Egyptians draw on this layered past in different ways, sometimes emphasizing one strand over another depending on politics, religion, and social context. Language is a particularly vivid example of layered history. Coptic, the final stage of the ancient Egyptian language written in a script that borrowed Greek letters, survived as a liturgical language even as Arabic became the daily tongue after the Arab conquest. The persistence of Coptic in churches and liturgy provides a living link to a pre-Islamic era, while Arabic absorbed loanwords and local idioms, illustrating the fluidity of linguistic change. Artistic influences from ancient Egypt have swum across centuries and borders. European artists in the 18th and 19th centuries embraced Egyptomania, incorporating pharaonic motifs into painting, architecture, and decorative arts. In modern times, Egyptian artists have reclaimed ancient symbols for contemporary expression, using them to comment on national identity, social critique, and the interplay between past and present. Politically, leaders have used ancient Egypt as both inspiration and instrument. The image of strong centralized authority, monumental construction, and the idea of a unique national lineage have been invoked by regimes seeking legitimacy. This instrumentalization of history can both unify and obscure, smoothing over the messy particulars of social life under the banner of an idealized past. Yet the historical truth resists such flattening. Ancient Egypt's decline and absorption into foreign empires were not simply failures, but also processes that created new possibilities. Each new ruling group, Persian, Greek, Roman, Arab, Ottoman, European, left marks and made innovations. These interactions enriched the cultural palette and introduced administrative practices, religious ideas, and artistic forms that would become part of Egypt's evolving identity. Religious changes, in particular, layered the spiritual landscape. As Egypt moved from polytheistic temple cults to Christianity and then to Islam, religious life reorganized but retained echoes of older beliefs. Local saints, holy sites, and rituals often overlapped or absorbed earlier motifs, producing a regional religious vocabulary that was both continuous and transformed across centuries. The physical landscape of Egypt itself preserves these palimpsests. Temples were converted into churches and later into mosques. Hieroglyphic inscriptions remained visible alongside painted Christian symbols and Arabic calligraphy. Stone does not forget easily, and the reuse of monuments speaks to a pragmatic continuity. Old stones were good stones, and building on the past was a practical as well as symbolic choice. Archaeological methods have brought more nuance to our understanding of decline and foreign rule. Instead of seeing abrupt collapses, modern scholars often trace long-term trends, economic shifts, climate variation, demographic changes that interplayed with military conquest and elite politics. This perspective emphasizes resilience and adaptation as much as vulnerability. Climate and environment enter the picture in ways that are sometimes subtle but profound. Variations in Nile floods, changes in rainfall in distant highlands, and longer-term climatic trends could impact crop yields and the tax base that supported large bureaucracies and monumental building. Environmental stress could intensify social tensions and make regions more susceptible to external pressure. Trade networks also mattered. Egypt's position as a hub connecting Africa, the Mediterranean, and Asia made it rich in resources and vulnerable to the fortunes of commerce. When trade routes shifted or when competing ports and powers rose, Egyptian cities felt the effects. A change in global demand for grain, textiles, or luxury goods could ripple through the valley, altering wealth distribution and political stability. The human costs of foreign rule were varied. For some, foreign administrations opened opportunities, trade networks provided new markets, and imperial bureaucracies offered careers to those who navigated them successfully. For others, occupation meant extraction of resources, displacement, and loss of traditional authority. Social stratification could deepen, but local elites often found ways to negotiate with new rulers to protect their interests. The legal and administrative innovations of various regimes also left traces. Roman law, Byzantine administrative structures, Islamic jurisprudence, and Ottoman land codes each reshaped governance in ways that influenced taxation, property, and social relations. These systems were not imposed as blank slates, they interacted with local customs, producing hybrid forms of rule that were tailored to the Nile's peculiarities. Education and literacy patterns shifted along with political changes. Alexandrian schools thrived in one era, monastic scribes in another, and Islamic madrasas in yet another. Each institution preserved and transmitted knowledge in ways that sustained intellectual life, whether classical learning, biblical exegesis, or Quranic scholarship. The legacy of learning in Egypt helped the country remain a cultural center across ages. The modern nation-state of Egypt inherited this layered past and has grappled with it in public memory, museum policy, and foreign relations. The state's relationship to antiquities reflects both pride and pragmatic diplomacy, as Egypt seeks to protect and celebrate its heritage while attracting tourists and negotiating with foreign museums. Heritage management has become a domain of national policy with economic, diplomatic, and cultural stakes. Global audiences continue to project fantasies onto ancient Egypt, ranging from exotic romance to pseudo-scientific claims. Egypt's monuments are magnets for imagination and myth, and such imaginings sometimes overshadow rigorous scholarship. Yet public fascination has also driven preservation efforts and inspired generations of students to study archaeology and history. Contemporary Egyptian culture weaves ancient motifs into new narratives, fashion designers borrow pharaonic motifs, filmmakers invoke pyramids as metaphors, and writers revisit ancient stories to speak about modern concerns. This cultural recycling keeps the ancient past alive in practical ways, allowing Egyptians and others to find meaning in history without mistaking revival for replication. The question of identity in modern Egypt is thus not about choosing a single ancestral thread, but about living with a multiplicity of inheritances. Pharaonic monuments may be the most visually arresting remnants of the past, yet Christianity, Islam, Arab language, Mediterranean trade, and African ties are all part of a tapestry that defines the country today. Recognizing this multiplicity allows for a richer and more honest appreciation of Egyptian history. International scholarship continues to refine our understanding of the roles played by decline and foreign rule in shaping Egypt. New archaeological techniques, DNA analysis of ancient remains, and reappraisals of textual sources produce fresh insights. These methodologies illuminate how population movements, intermarriage, and cultural exchange contributed to a changing society over centuries. Museums and monuments have also become sites of contested meaning. Debates about restitution and access reflect broader questions about who owns the past and who gets to tell its story. For many Egyptians, the return of key artifacts is a matter of dignity and historical rectification. For international museums, the question touches on preservation capabilities and global public access. Such debates have produced both tension and cooperation. Economic development and heritage preservation are often in tension. Urban expansion, infrastructure projects, and agricultural intensification can threaten archaeological sites. At the same time, local communities often see heritage as a potential source of livelihood through tourism, handicrafts, and cultural events. Balancing preservation with development remains an ongoing challenge for policymakers and communities alike. The stories of individual artifacts reveal larger patterns. The Rosetta Stone's decipherment unlocked a linguistic world, while the unwrapping of royal tombs taught us about burial practices, social stratification, and international trade in antiquity. Small objects, pottery shards, textiles, inscriptions, fill out daily life in ways that grand monuments cannot, reminding us that decline and foreign rule affected ordinary lives as surely as they reshaped kingdoms. Archaeologists increasingly emphasize community archaeology, inviting local voices into decisions about excavation and display. This practice aims to democratize heritage and to ensure that the benefits of discovery are not monopolized by foreign institutions. Involving local people helps preserve intangible heritage, stories, crafts, rituals that connects present communities to the past in living ways. Film and media have transformed how the public imagines ancient Egypt. Documentaries, historical dramas, and popular books reach millions, shaping perceptions whether accurate or not. While sensationalist accounts can mislead, engaging storytelling has also introduced broad audiences to the depth and complexity of Egyptian history, fueling interest and support for research and conservation. The Nile's enduring centrality ties the ancient and modern worlds. Urban sprawl and climate change pose new threats to water management, agriculture, and coastal cities. Contemporary disputes over Nile waters among regional states echo the ancient valley's reliance on a single life-giving river. The environmental challenges of our age bring into stark relief the fragility and the resilience that have always characterized life along the Nile. Egypt's large diaspora also plays a role in the global conversation about heritage and identity. Egyptians abroad fund restorations, advocate for repatriation, and participate in scholarly debates. The diaspora's interest in the pharaonic past can be a source of cultural pride and political engagement, connecting scattered communities to a shared narrative that spans millennia. Education about ancient Egypt has become more inclusive, offering multiple perspectives rather than a single heroic narrative. Curricula increasingly incorporate the roles of women, commoners, and foreign communities in reshaping Egyptian society. This broader lens enriches our understanding of decline and foreign rule by showing who adapted, who resisted, and who negotiated new identities in changing times. Women's histories in Egypt challenge simplistic portrayals of passive subjects under foreign rule. Queens, priestesses, artisans, and merchants played active roles at different periods, sometimes wielding enormous influence. Cleopatra's political agency is legendary, but lesser-known women, administrators, temple officials, and business owners also shaped economic and social life. Their stories complicate narratives of decline by revealing continuity of agency amid change. Every phase of foreign rule brought technological and cultural exchange. Greek science in Alexandria, Roman engineering and infrastructure, Islamic scholarship in medicine and mathematics, Ottoman administrative practices, and European scientific archaeology all contributed different kinds of knowledge to Egyptian society. These exchanges were not one-way, they transformed those who brought ideas as much as those who received them. The notion of decline itself deserves careful thought. Civilizations rarely vanish neatly, they transform. What looks like collapse from the vantage of monument building may also include processes of reinvention, diffusion, and cultural creativity. In Egypt, the end of pharaonic political sovereignty set the stage for new creative syntheses: Hellenistic Alexandria, Coptic Christianity, Islamic Cairo, that cannot be reduced to simple loss. Looking at the longue durée of Egyptian history, a striking theme emerges: continuity through adaptation. Stone temples outlast regimes, languages morph and persist in liturgy and idiom, religious forms absorb and adapt. These threads show a civilization that did not vanish when its political form changed, but that found ways to live on within new structures and relationships. To hear the echoes of ancient Egypt in the present is to listen for continuity and change at once. Modern scholarship, conservation, and public engagement continue to uncover and reinterpret the past. Whether through a museum display, a university lecture, a restored tomb, or a local festival, the ancient world remains present in the rhythms of modern life along the Nile. In this long story, foreign rule was not merely a replacement of masters but a process of mutual influence, negotiation, and at times violent conflict. Each wave of outside power reorganized administration and economy while borrowing from local practices. These interactions produced hybrid cultures that were both distinctively Egyptian and unmistakably shaped by exchange. The legacy of ancient Egypt, therefore, is not a museum of frozen grandeur but a living conversation between past and present. Monuments speak in stone and dust, in repairs and graffiti, in pilgrimages and postcards. Behind every tourist image, there are centuries of human choices, conquest and conversion, adaptation and resistance that made the modern nation possible. In the quiet of a temple hall, the carved eyes of pharaohs still seem to watch centuries of change. Their gaze is ambiguous. It recalls glory but also tells a story of succession, of foreign crowns and local resilience. When we study the decline of pharaonic rule and the succession of foreign rulers, we are not merely tracing political shifts but listening to the many voices that continue to shape Egypt's identity across the ages. As you imagine the sweep of rivers and empires, remember that history's texture is composed of countless individual lives. Farmers recalibrated cropping schedules when taxes changed, priests negotiated with new magistrates, artisans adapted styles to suit new patrons, and families navigated marriages that linked different ethnic or religious communities. These personal adaptations were the building blocks of larger historical transformations. The modern world's fascination with ancient Egypt will likely endure, but so will the responsibilities that come with such fascination. Protecting monuments, supporting local communities, fostering collaborative scholarship, and acknowledging past injustices and the removal of artifacts are practical steps that honor the living legacy of the Nile Valley. These efforts help ensure that Egypt's past remains a resource for all who seek to understand the human story. In the end, the decline of ancient Egypt as an independent pharaonic polity was not a final darkness but part of a longer illumination. Foreign rule transformed Egypt, introduced new structures, and at times caused suffering, yet it also seeded hybrid cultures, new ideas, and resilient communities. The legacy of ancient Egypt is thus both deep and diffuse, an inheritance not confined to museums but present in language, law, religion, art, and the very people who continue to live along the Nile. This is a story without a neat final chapter, because history is ongoing. Archaeologists still uncover new evidence, historians reframe old arguments, and cultures continue to reappropriate and reinterpret the past. As long as people study, visit, and care for Egypt's monuments and communities, the conversation between ancient and modern will continue, showing that decline and foreign rule are only part of a longer tale of survival and transformation.